It's very unreliable. All right, here we go. And we're officially live. So welcome everybody to a Ukraine War update stream. This is, of course, the 79th anniversary of the bomb plot against Hitler. Because I know that everybody on the internet knows everything about World War II, so there you go. There's your World War II fact of the evening. Joining me tonight so far are Michael Kraemer and Jonathon Dreeze. Sean is having some technical issues, but he will be with us when those are resolved. So, we don't really have a plan of attack per se, much like the Russians apparently. But what we will do is just talk about what has happened since the last time we discussed the war. And I'm pretty sure this is the first time we've discussed this as a group in 2023. And the last time we discussed it, I believe, was right before the Ukrainians launched their major counteroffensive, yes?
Around that time, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, let's go ahead and take a look at the map. We use the English map here. And things have been stagnant for quite a while, I would say. The provinces that the Russians came in to claim, they still mostly hold. And they also hold some things to the south of that, which I suppose serves the purpose of securing the flank and also blocking the path to Crimea. But, of course, all the early attacks on Kiev and deeper areas have long failed, and there's not really any prospect of a huge breakthrough that will result in the gobbling up of a massive amount of territory.
Yeah, I think we've seen, or I remember when this conflict first started, and when kind of the magnitude of the initial Russian military failure became clear. We saw a lot of those images and memes online of Ukrainian tractors taking away or hauling away Russian tanks and artillery and armored personnel carriers. With tractors because they'd run out of fuel or the Russians had abandoned them because of the Ukrainian counterattack or counteroffensive. We also saw kind of the Russians lose a lot of land around Kharkiv last September, I believe, and we haven't seen those images for a while, and it seems like the war of like a lot of movement, a lot of major offensives has kind of bogged down into kind of attrition-style trench warfare fighting.
Yeah, certainly what I've heard. And I guess right now, both sides seem to be having a whole lot of problems keeping their troops supplied with sufficient ammo. Especially artillery shells. Even the most basic artillery shells are woefully short.
Right.
Yeah, I know the Russians. They were when the kind of in the first year of the war, they were cranking out, or they were using a lot of their artillery reserves, and I think a lot of those was left over from a lot of that stock was left over from the Soviet period, and now I think they've used most of their kind of Soviet era stock. And I know there were reports and rumors a few months ago that they were buying old artillery shells from North Korea, which sounds sketchy. I wouldn't trust any artillery shells coming from North Korea, but I'm not sure if that was accurate or if it was just a rumor. But yeah, it is interesting how Russia, which you would think would have a kind of a well-developed defense industry, seems to be unable to produce enough shells.
Well, from what I've heard on Perun's channel, they are having a shell shortage, but they also do have enough barrels in reserve, because one thing about artillery pieces is that they only really function so many times where you have to replace the barrel. But to give you an idea of how many rounds they've cooked off, apparently they've had to replace something like 5,400 barrels, but they have plenty in reserve, so that's one area where they're not in any serious danger of running out. But it does show you just how many rounds they've been cooking off. If 5,400 pieces have had to, be overhauled.
Yeah, that's quite a bit of artillery.
Yeah.
Hello?
Hey, Sean.
Hello, hello.
Hey,
Hello.
everybody. I just had to restart Firefox and get myself set again. So here now. No, it's been a while. How's everybody?
Doing all
Pretty
right.
good.
All right, man. All right. So what was everybody talking about?
Well, we're just talking about the current state of the war militarily. How it's a war that has effectively gone stagnant, and how both sides are struggling to stay supplied with even artillery shells at the moment.
Okay.
Anyway, I guess the big controversy that's emerged over the last, I would say, 2 or 3 weeks, is that the Biden administration okayed the selling of cluster munitions to the Ukrainians.
Yeah, because they had run out of the other artillery rounds to give them. I mean, that was providing the Ukrainians with artillery, heavy artillery rounds in 2022 is instrumental in them uh, being able to hold the Russians back and then regain some territory. But now we just really can't supply them. So give them cluster munitions, which to my knowledge actually are not really that effective for this kind of fighting, but it's all we got. You know?
Yeah, and I guess there are certain places in the world where they're banned, but neither Ukraine nor Russia are signatories to that particular treaty that bans the use of cluster munitions.
Yeah.
And
Um,
and I think Russia has used cluster munitions already in this conflict, if I'm not mistaken.
They probably
yes.
have.
Yes, they have. Yes, they have. But once again, from what I've read, they're not particularly. Cluster munitions, I believe, were developed more for like the Vietnam War, and I mean, it's anti-personnel munitions, but you're not going to be. Well, not, to my knowledge, you're not really going to be blowing up fortified positions, which is what the Ukrainians really need.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
Yeah, that
Well, I
makes
mean,
sense.
well, yeah. I mean, well, they can't they from what I've read, they can't get past even the initial Russian defensive lines. You know, um, the counteroffensive so far has been just a disaster, really. Um, but there's a lot of evidence that a lot of Ukrainian generals were signaling, "Hey, we really shouldn't be doing this." But orders were orders from the top.
So, just to comment briefly on the sort of stagnation of the lines, it's worth to mention the sort of overall casualties. And we got estimates. So, U.S. estimates casualties up to 21st of May of this year
Okay.
are 20,000 Ukrainians killed, 130,000 wounded, 50,000 Russians killed, and 180,000 wounded. So part of this as well, this has been a really bloody, intense war, right? Like, so I mean, it's a lot has been put into this by both sides, and it's not something that's super easy to recover from. So stagnations of lines, regardless, is unsurprising. I would say.
Yeah, yeah. Um, Although time is on the Russian side.
I
Um,
completely disagree with you. We can get into that
oh
in a
my
second.
god. Yeah. We're going to be at polar opposites on this one. I believe time has always been on Russia's side.
well, I guess one factor we have to consider is the morale of each side, because I think, in terms of pure resources, obviously Russia still has the advantage, but there's a lot of evidence that support for the war is less than complete. Um, Other than the obvious Wagner company mutiny, there's also, I think, right now 20,000 Russians who have gone to jail for protesting the war.
So yeah, so I don't want to jump straight into the Wagner company stuff yet. It does that deserves a long discussion though. So maybe
Mm-hmm.
after we do just a 20-minute overall assessment of stuff, maybe we can head to that afterwards.
Yeah, that's fair.
I did want to kind of circle back to the whole kind of stagnation of the situation, because it reminds me a bit of World War I and even the Iran-Iraq War, where we had kind of armies in kind of formal battle lines, or kind of trench systems, and a lot of trench warfare, a lot of kind of attrition warfare and heavy casualties. And I teach about trench warfare and World War One in my military history classes, and I kind of talk about how at least in that context, one rationale for the trench warfare, like no one originally wanted to fight that way, but just kind of the imbalance of defensive and offensive technologies was kind of one of the reasons, and kind of the lack of development or development of military tactics was one of the reasons why trench warfare kind of became the norm, at least on the Western Front. And I was wondering, before we kind of move on to some other things, like to talk about kind of like why is it stagnating, or why is it kind of why are we seeing images that seem reminiscent of Europe in 1917 or Iran and Iraq in 1987? Do you guys think?
The two things I would think of is, on the one hand, modern warfare becoming stagnant like this is not unusual. I mean, we also have the Korean War. You can even make a case for the Pacific War. Essentially, it was a lot of Marines charging fortified Japanese positions, and the Italian front in World War II as well. One thing that's really stuck out to me in this war is and somebody will indicate this was the case, but if you have opponents that have similar technology, we have to keep in mind that the weapons of today are just extremely lethal, in ways that they weren't even 50 years ago. And of course, the use of drones and satellites and all the rest. Being able to pull off an offensive is going to be more difficult. One of the big ones is it's going to be hard to surprise your enemy, which you can make a case that's one of the reasons why some of the initial Russian advances, at least not, in the Donbass region, ran into problems, because apparently those Russian units were given the order to attack less than 24 hours before they did, which reminded me of the Battle of the Bulge. Had a similar problem. For the Germans to gain surprise, they essentially didn't even tell their men they were being involved in an offensive until, in some cases, 6 hours before they threw them in. And I mean, it worked insofar as when we would capture Germans. I mean, some of them said an offensive's coming, but a lot of them had no idea. Germans getting captured in the area, but it also meant that these units weren't as prepared. For one thing, in the Battle of the Bulge, the last thing about that is the Germans did almost no probes in the area before the attack. To be like, okay, well, where's this American unit, and what's the terrain like in this area? And so they went in blind, and that led to some very heavy losses in the first few days of the offensive for the Germans. Now, Battle of the Bulge, we could detect that nowadays with the kind of technology we have. So it's a very, a lot of offensives work by achieving some element of surprise, and that's just really hard to achieve right now.
I think that's part of it, but in some ways, new military technologies, make it almost surprising that there's this stagnation, actually. So you look at the recent Armenian-Azerbaijan war. Azerbaijan just won that war very quickly using heavily coordinated masses of drones. We're not seeing them used in the same way at this war. And it doesn't seem as effective, right? You would think some of these sort of new technologies would actually change that, but yet we're in the same sort of war we were in, and they're in the same sort of war they were in 2014, of just artillery strikes, going over each side of a stagnant front line.
I think you get involved with the Russian tradition of being an artillery army. With the exception of the First World War, every war the Russians are in, their artillery is excellent. Even the Crimean War, which is one of the most wretched performances by the Russian army itself, but their artillery was still excellent. There's that, but and if I'm not mistaken, this is one of Prigozhin's complaints, was that the Russian generals want a slow, methodical, artillery-based advance, because they believe that is to their advantage. So, so that's another reason too.
And it's worth mentioning the differences we are seeing in the war are how asymmetric warfare is occurring. And so drones are, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I've read from reports, drones don't seem like they're as used on the front lines to gain advantage. They're used as almost like civilian bombing campaigns, right?
Yeah. I mean, there are surveillance drones, but both sides have gotten pretty good about shooting them down. So they become less useful in that regard as it goes on, from what I remember reading. But yeah, there's a lot of use for civilian attacks by both sides.
And I think that's sort of the other surprising thing about this is the fact that Russia so quickly in this war went to asymmetric warfare. And you don't necessarily expect that out of an army that was supposedly more militarily superior to Ukraine, right?
Yeah. And I'm sorry, Mike. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
And I was kind of wondering, like, to what extent is I think you guys make excellent points. And I think another question to kind of tag onto those is, like, to what extent is this an indication of the fact that we have a stalemate is an indication of just like how poorly the Russians have conducted or prepared this war? Because I think Mike makes a good point that Russia is using these asymmetric or kind of these more civilian-centric terror bombing strategies, and you wouldn't think that the Russian army would have to do that. You would think that they would be equipped, have at least the images that came out of Russia over the past few years, the propaganda images, were that it was a modern professional army, and that it was, or that it should have been well equipped or prepared to kind of steamroll through Ukraine, or at least not get bogged down in a stalemate type of situation. And kind of on the other side, the fact that Ukraine and the Ukrainian military has been able to fight to a stalemate the Russian army is both, I think, a testament to the abilities of the Ukrainian military, but also an indication that Russia is still unable to establish a level of military dominance that one would expect. Like, they still don't have air superiority over Ukraine, and it's now been a year and a half, and still on paper the Russian Air Force seems to outnumber the Ukrainian Air Force several times over. And it's like, what is this? Is the stalemate because of Ukrainian professionalism and just Russian or kind of being unprepared for this, combined with kind of the technology or the strategies that they were being used?
Well, I mean, if it's any by way of analogy, if it's similar to the problem they had with tanks early in the war, where they were having to take things out of storage to strip parts off of them or ship old tanks to the front, it's possible the Russians simply don't have enough parts to keep a lot of their planes in the air.
Mm-hmm.
I think go ahead.
Oh, no, you go ahead, Michael.
I was just gonna say, I think part of it is honestly the pilots are poorly trained. No, I mean seriously, the number of pilots who are shot down by Ukrainian forces consistently is kind of shocking.
I'm not surprised by that, though. It's not a question of poor training, as much as it is also the fact that Ukrainians have a similar air defense system to the Russians, and the Russians are acknowledged to have the best air defense system in the world, because that's something that the USSR put a lot of money into. So I think the Russian air. I know the Russians also do have problems in aircraft manufacture as well. So they can't afford to take such heavy losses. So they have to show more restraint. Although, to be fair, the Russian Air Force has been a lot more active in the last few months as the Ukrainian air defenses degrade over time.
Yeah, I mean, there have been more bombings of cities. Whether that means a frontline advance or not, I think is a much different sort of question.
We'd also have to wonder. You'd also have to look into. I mean, what was the Russian doctrine anyway with their air force? They emphasized not attacking your aircraft and winning dogfights, but actually blowing up airfields, blowing up the infrastructure to support an air force. That was their emphasis, at least before the war, as well. But at any rate, though, I don't know. I think Russian incompetence is much overstated in this war. Doesn't mean they haven't made mistakes. I'd say the two biggest ones was not mobilizing in the summer of 2022 because Putin was afraid to, unsure of himself, unsure how people would react to it. And also having a more divided command structure going in to the war, I think was a major mistake by the Russians. But, I mean, ultimately, they've been able to gain the most important piece of territory that they wanted. Casualty figures are hotly debated by both sides. I won't say who suffered more because I've seen figures all over the place. You have the American ones, Ukrainian ones, which are really fantastical. Russian ones, which are, also fantastical in some way respects. But, ultimately, I think we'd have to consider that the way the war has been prosecuted also depends on what the Russian aims were. And that's really hard to know because we can't, Putin's never exactly said explicitly what they were doing and why they were doing what they were doing. I've heard several different explanations for the drive on Kiev, for instance.
Well, I kind of disagree on that.
Yeah,
He gave a very long speech. He gave several long speeches. I think one was on the hang on here, the 21st of February.
Which year?
The 21st of February in 2022, right before the war started, where he kind of basically said, like, Ukraine, isn't a real nation. Ukraine is an aberration of Soviet nationality policy. The Ukrainians are just, Russians with accents, that it's not a real nation. And I think he had grand ambitions to conquer the whole country, or at least much of it, as we saw with kind of the drive on Kyiv early on in the war. I think the biggest part of the Russian incompetence was the idea that they could take Ukraine quickly at the start of the war, and I think grossly underestimated the Ukrainian military. But I think, like Putin, in trying to save face, I think he has muddied the water a bit on like exactly what he's trying to do. I think official rhetoric coming out of the Russian government about like, well, we got to get rid of the Banderites or the Nazis, the neo-Nazis that are running Ukraine. That was a big narrative when the war began, and I think that narrative has kind of died down a bit quite a bit, at least from official government channels, when it became clear that they're not going to be able to throw Zelensky out of Kyiv. They're not going to be able to easily defeat the Ukrainian military, and it has settled into like holding these 4 provinces and Crimea in the southeast.
Well, you misunderstand me on this. I'm talking about what the drive on Kiev was meant to precisely do. Now you're saying based on that speech that it was meant to lead to the whole collapse of Ukraine and take the whole country over. I've seen other arguments say that it was simply there to force Ukrainians to the negotiating table. But wait, maybe it wasn't at first. Maybe it was meant as a decapitation strike, and then as it didn't work as planned, then it was only meant to force them to the negotiation table. I'm just talking about that in its specifics. Degree to which they want to conquer all of Ukraine, debatable.
I mean, I don't know, man. When you use that sort of rhetoric of Ukrainians aren't real, they're just fake Russians, they need to be eradicated, like that's the sort of rhetoric that the Russians have been using.
Don't think he was saying eradication.
He was talking a lot like that in his speeches. Like he's basically saying Ukrainians aren't a real people. Like that's a lot of dog whistling and signaling there.
I mean, is that I'm talking about what the actual intentions are, as opposed to a rhetoric to rally a people, which that could also be.
I mean, this is where
that's not condoning rhetoric. I'm just saying that we use similar language about Germany in World War II and Japan. We kept them around.
I don't necessarily see the comparison there, but
really, we suddenly wanted to exterminate the Japanese. Like that was said by numerous American leaders during World War II. Did not happen.
Oh no, I literally didn't understand what you meant.
Yeah. Okay. Gotcha.
But this is where I wanted to sort of refer to like Dreeze here. I mean, Dreeze, your dissertation is on Soviet propaganda, and in some ways, like modern Russian propaganda hasn't changed a whole lot. What do you make the difference between like the message Putin is telling Russians and what the actual aims are and what the actual ideology is at the top level. I mean, what's your take on it?
Well, I think it's on the one hand, kind of old Soviet, so like Communist Party agitprop is, I think, on the one hand, quite a bit different from what we see today. Partly because just like technology is quite different. You know, there was no internet in the 30s and 40s and 50s, and I also think another big difference is that with Soviet propaganda and Communist Party propaganda, there was kind of a hard ideological line. It definitely kind of swayed and wavered depending on who was in power at the time, and what and who had or had not been purged, especially in the Stalin period. But I think one big difference is that the Soviet ideology was much more coherent, it was much more defined. It had classical texts and whatnot. And I think while there is a line of ideology with Putin, you know, I think there's a very kind of imperialist, Russian nationalist kind of core ideological idea to what Putin is doing, but I think it's a lot less defined in some contexts than kind of old Soviet propaganda.
He's not very.
I think
he's more practical than ideological from my readings of the guy.
I think I don't know about that. I think kind of like one of the big, or I'm not sure if big idea or kind of large, vaguely defined ideas is the idea of like Russia continuing to be a great power, having its own sphere of influence, and of needing to kind of reclaim, either through direct or indirect means, kind of influence over old territories from the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. And I think, you know, kind of taking that kind of goal, ideological goal, national goal, combining it with like really strong form of Russian nationalism and kind of cherry picking ideas from the imperial era and from the Soviet era, I think that comes together to form some, I think, real a more vague ideological message that the current Russian government is using. And to that extent, I think it can be. It is possible to boil down kind of current Russian ideology to expansionism, to like Russia as Russia against the world, you know, holy Russia, orthodoxy, Russian nationalism is fighting against, you know, bourgeois or decadent Western influences. But I think it can be vague enough around certain edges that it, you know, to kind of the question, well, what was Putin trying to do? It's vague enough that Putin can be like, well, at one point in time we're fighting the Nazis. The other point in time we are fighting for Russian rights in Zaporizhia or in eastern Ukraine. At one point in time we're trying to get rid of Ukraine. At one point in time we're just reclaiming land that is rightfully, quote unquote, rightfully ours. So I think it's, to kind of go back to Mike's question about the big differences, I think the Putin's ideology, if you can call it that, is more vaguely defined, and he's a bit more opportunistic in like what he's. It's not as vaguely defined or not as structured as a way like he can focus on certain ideas, certain concepts whenever they seem kind of convenient to him. If that makes sense.
It also should be kept in mind, too, that, I mean, you know, this is also true of a lot of imperialism as well. I mean, if you look at the British Empire, a lot of the lands they acquire, they're always saying, well, we got to get these before these other guys do, you know? Or we have to protect our interests there. But, you know, Russian imperialism is also, of course, rooted in the need for buffer states to avoid horrific invasions. It's been said that the Russians, in many ways, had never quite gotten over Mongol domination from centuries past. You know,
I don't know. I think that's a bit of a stereotype.
Really, you don't think that they acquire land to gain buffer states because they have a history of being attacked and overrun?
No, they definitely have a history of that, but to like, you know, to harken back to 500 or 600 years ago and kind of use that to explain kind of the war, the conflict today, I think is too simplistic. Like I don't buy any of the arguments that NATO expansion is the result of this.
Well, I do. Being upfront, I do believe NATO expansion is the heart of the conflict. Although there's a lot of other factors involved as well, including ethnic conflict within Ukraine. That being said, I actually don't fully endorse that Mongol thesis. I think they're going to, of course, it's more important to harken back to what happens in both world wars and what happens in the 1990s with the Soviet Union, or with the way that that goes down. And the trauma of the 1990s in many ways is what we're seeing play out.
I also read up earlier today on Bush's relations with Russia, and I think that is also a contributing
Which
factor.
Bush?
Bush
George the
two,
First or George the Second?
George the Second.
George the Second.
Yeah. So, like Sean was saying, with the '90s, with Bill Clinton, obviously there was tension, and then, especially during 9/11, Putin reached out. Bush was receptive, and they kind of had a couple years where they were getting along well, and then things fell apart over the course of the Bush administration. And a lot of that was because Bush would get angry if Putin would push back on some of his plans, say the invasion of Iraq. And so Bush began to move away from trying to do deals with Russia and started to see them as hostile. And he could take out his spite on them more than he could on, say, the French when they would oppose his plans.
Yeah.
So that might have been the best moment to really diffuse tensions that were created in the '90s, but it was bungled. And that also,
Probably
of
not
course,
gonna
led to
happen,
the
man.
infamous reset button.
I mean,
Yeah. Neoconservatives, though, too, just adding that real quick. You also keep in mind, too, the neoconservatives who were, of course, dominant in Bush and are dominant right now with Joe Biden. We think of them as being involved in the war on terror, but, they've been very hostile to Russia since the 1990s. Well, of course, what am I saying? Neoconservatism is born in trying to destroy the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
It's
So-
an old foe.
I want to say two quick things. First off, I agree, like Derek, I agree with your assessment and Sean about the war in Iraq. I actually think it's quite important for Russian ideology because in some senses it was the U.S. ignoring the principle of sovereignty for ideological aims, and Russia consistently in sort of the post-Cold War world, the idea of sovereignty was very important to them, and same for China as well. And so it really that did ruin any sort of chance of a reset of relations. I think for other reasons that reset of relations was probably never going to happen, because of the focus on buffer states. But the invasion of Iraq was very detrimental. I just want to challenge one quick thing, John. Neoconservatism for Biden, I think more liberal internationalist sort of fits the bill here. Like,
isn't that? Oh, I think the two work out pretty well together. I mean, he has a variety of neocons under him. Not some of those prominent ones in the Bush years, but some of their underlings. Big one being Victoria Nuland. I mean, she's like, she used to work for Cheney, under Secretary of State. But you think liberal internationalism? I mean, maybe the neoconservatives have shifted over to that now. That's what it looks like to me.
I mean, the war on terror was effectively ended by Biden. I mean, there were no more, secret drone strikes anywhere in the world.
They just shifted. Well, I think one of the reasons why he didn't go back to Afghanistan was to shift our resources against Russia and China.
Wait, this is off subject. It was just like because there is a difference between supporting an order and supporting NATO and defending U.S. allies and offensive war, right?
Look, to me, this, we're getting to causation debates, but ultimately we are messing around with their equivalent of Mexico, with our equivalent to Mexico. You're going to get a reaction from that, and Barack Obama was completely correct when he said that in that region of the world, the Russians have the escalatory advantage. The advantage in escalation. So, I view this as a strategic dead end for us and a mistake.
Again, getting into the causes of the war. Ukraine was not offered NATO membership. Ukraine was not offered EU membership. Russia did a premeditated invasion of Ukraine. So, I don't know.
I'm not talking about who's right here necessarily. I'm talking about we do not have the escalatory advantage in Ukraine. We are giving the cluster munitions now. We've run out of regular shells. Nobody has enough tanks to give these people anymore. And the tanks that were sent in, a lot of them got blown to pieces in the last few weeks. You know, it's a similar thing with Taiwan in many ways.
Anyway.
I'm not sure if I see the analogy with Taiwan since there's no active fighting there. And
No, I mean the advantage in escalation. You know, I'm talking about the logistics of warfare. How many resources can you get there, and how many do you have?
Well, I think you'd be
Other
right
guy-
when it comes to
militarily-
Russia being advantaged when it comes to fighting in Ukraine. The big difference in my mind between that and Taiwan is that although China is far more powerful than Russia, they're not that powerful navally, at least not compared to the U.S., and they have to ship everything over a sea to get to Taiwan. So I think that would actually be quite different.
Yeah, that could be, but we get into the whole argument about like how vulnerable is our surface fleet to submarines, because submarines right now are across the board are becoming even more and more quiet, and a lot of submariners, the ones I've spoken to, they say now they view surface ships as just sitting ducks to be destroyed, so I don't know, man. I mean, how many subs can we deploy against theirs? I admit I don't know a ton about the Chinese military, and probably nobody on this panel does. And you know what? A lot of that's because the Chinese are pretty damn secret about a lot of stuff with that.
I love how they call it the People's Liberation Army Navy.
Yeah, it's a great name. One of the best ever.
Yeah.
Well, that's like what was that unit in World War II? The Hermann Goering Division was the Parachute Panzer Division because the Luftwaffe ran the division.
Right.
Because when you're in a plane, you also need a tank.
Yeah. Well, I'm just imagining Tiger tanks just rolling out of Junkers 52s,
Yeah, or if you put the Tiger on the runway, it won't even be able to taxi. It'll the wheels will just break off and it'll be stuck wherever you loaded the tank.
The Parachute Panzer Division. Goofy name. People's Liberation Army Navy. But yeah, so.
So, do we want to jump in and talk about morale of both Ukraine and Russia? And sort of the subpoint of that, do we want to talk about Prigozhin and the Wagner Group and all that?
Sure. Also want to hear what people think about the economics of the war. But about how it's economically affected what I would say the four main players here: Russia, Ukraine, Europe, America. But
yeah,
go ahead on about morale.
Yeah, sounds good. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Well, I think from one of the things I've read, I think morale in the Russian army is pretty shit right now. I think one of the main reasons for the Wagner mutiny is that, or at least within the Wagner group, one of the main reasons was like the lack of appreciation or the lack of supplies that the Ministry of Defense and the official Russian military was supplying to Wagner. But, you had Prigozhin kind of making all these videos criticizing Shoigu, criticizing Gerasimov, criticizing the MOD about supplying the Wagner group, never fully openly denouncing Putin or denouncing the war. But one interesting thing that I think kind of came of that is that there are now other Russian military commanders, people like Popov and a few others, who are now kind of doing the same thing. They are now kind of posting videos online, criticizing not so much the war, not so much Putin, but criticizing Shoigu and Gerasimov. They're saying our soldiers aren't being equipped. They are dying in large numbers. Something needs to be done. Something needs to change. And according to the Institute of War, a lot of these kind of more insubordinate commanders are, one, you could say that they're being purged. They're being removed from commands. They're being shuffled to like Syria or Nagorno-Karabakh. Especially after the Wagner mutiny, because I think Putin is now much more concerned after having, tens of thousands of soldiers potentially marching on Moscow, that if you have these commanders who are openly critical of the way the war is being fought, then they could form another possible cohesive opposition to Putin. But I think it's a larger indication that the war is rotting away the morale of the Russian army. It's not looking good for morale in general. And I think morale in Ukraine had been pretty high. It's probably suffered a little bit with their kind of summer offensive not producing as big results as I think people had hoped for.
Right.
Well, I mean, and it should be kept in mind that, both sides are also resorting to some pretty aggressive impressment tactics to fill out the ranks. Which is standard. I don't know of too many wars where people enthusiastically keep volunteering to fight throughout the whole thing.
Not after those casualty counts.
No. When people talk about World War II, right? We started having recruitment shortfalls in World War II and had to resort to more aggressive drafting as the war went on. As much as we think everybody, everybody's mother joined up as soon as Pearl Harbor got bombed, but actually, if you look at it, almost everybody who joined up were unemployed when the war started.
Yeah, there are stories, or there's been a trickle of stories about. I'm currently in Kazakhstan right now, and there have been a lot of stories about migrants from Central Asia who have been kind of press ganged or shanghaied into serving in the Russian military. Either they're with both kind of carrot and stick tactics, like a quick avenue to Russian citizenship, benefits and whatnot if you sign up and with a contract or sign up to fight in the Russian army. And there are other instances of police and migration officials in Russia kind of rounding up Central Asian migrants, some who maybe they're illegally, and being like, look, you can either go to jail or go fight in the Russian army. It's and I think I mean there are probably people Central Asians fighting in the Russian army who chose to out of their own volition, but there are probably probably more who have been kind of dragooned and forced into it. And I think I don't have the news story in front of me, but I do recall several months ago there was a shooting, I think, in one of the forward bases in Russia, maybe around Belgorod or Smolensk, where there was a shooting on a Russian military base, and it was, I think, one or two soldiers from Tajikistan who got a hold of a weapon and opened fire at a Russian military base on Russian soldiers because they had been mocking them either for their religion or for their ethnicity.
Wow.
Question, then, if Russian morale is as poor as you think it is, then why are the Ukrainians doing so poorly in this counteroffensive?
I mean,
what do you mean?
Well, if Russian morale is that poor, why are the Ukrainians doing so poorly in the counteroffensive? I mean, if the morale is bad, historically, if an army's morale is that bad, they typically just crack.
So Sean, my argument, I think it gets back to your previous discussion and previous sort of argument on Russia being an artillery army, right? Having enough artillery supplies. The Russian army doesn't have to do, at least the frontline soldiers don't have to do a whole lot if they have artillery cover, consistent, good artillery cover. It's tough to break, to offensively overcome that if you don't have good air superiority, good drones, or good counter artillery, right? So the Russians can hold a line. The question is whether they can do any offensive action. The answer is pretty much no. And so,
they do limited offensives where they gain territory, but once again, that's limited offensives.
I mean, we're talking tiny villages, and you can see it on both sides, right? Because I will definitely agree that you go on social media, especially Western social media, and there are a lot of sort of Ukrainian propaganda being thrown out. Not Ukrainian propaganda in terms of saying the Ukrainians are it's not just it's them talking about how it's a just cause and it's not a just cause. No, I mean, it's a just cause. They're defending their homeland, right? But propaganda in terms of, we captured this. And then you look on the map. What did they capture? They captured a town of 20 abandoned homes, right? Like that's the granular level this war is being fought in, and that's the level to which the front's moving, and it's not.
That's the thing, though. The thing is, you're talking about stalemate in perpetuity. It's possible you have something more like a 1918 situation. I mean, possible here, right? Germans launched their big offensives. Their big offensives are failures. The army is chewed up. And then the attritional aspects of the war, because your army is starting to crack down, means you can advance. Well, once the Ukrainian army, I mean, I'm not saying this is what's necessarily going to work, but I feel like that's what the Russians are going for, is we'll just blast them to pieces, let this counteroffensive keep going, and then eventually they will just collapse, which has happened before. It is a proven military strategy. It's a very slow one, very bloody, and it's also not very American, must be said, which I think is why the Petersburg campaign and the Civil War has always made people, and American military historians, just sort of scratch their head when they look at it.
There is one thing to keep in mind, though, while you're using World War II analogy. One is that defending forces don't necessarily have to have the greatest morale if they have advantages like the ones we're seeing in this war that clearly accrue when you're on the defensive. And two, the other big factor in the German collapse isn't so much just that the Ludendorff offensives failed and that reinforcements came for the Allies. The huge factor is that the Germans ran out of food.
Yeah, massive factor.
Well, I think kind of what Derek also pointed out is, we had the mutinies in the French army during World War I in 1917, and the French army refused to advance or fight anymore after, I think it was the Nivelle offensive, but they didn't collapse, they didn't full on retreat, or they didn't kind of withdraw from the front on their own. They just kind of sat in situ and refused to advance any further. And even with like the Kerensky offensive of the summer of 1917, it was a big Russian offensive that the provisional government tried to launch, and it failed, and it resulted in the collapse of the cohesive Russian military unit, or of the old Imperial Russian army, and then the Bolsheviks were able to craft the Red Army from its remnants later on. But I know historians think that if Kerensky hadn't gone on the offensive, if the provisional Russian army had just kind of held the line and been on the defensive, they probably wouldn't have collapsed, or the provisional government would have lasted longer. So I think morale's low with the Russians, but they are kind of sitting in place. They're not launching major offensives.
I think this actually
don't think they can.
I think this is probably more akin to the 1917 French mutiny, because there's a very important thing about mutiny. They went out of their way to make sure that the Germans didn't know about it, and they all swore, if the Germans attack, we'll fight as hard as we did at Verdun. We're just not going to, once again, make a suicidal attack.
Right.
As to the Kerensky offensive, don't know as much about that one. I've also read, though, that they might have cracked anyway, because one, German tactics at that point are just that much better than Russian tactics in 1917. But also the Kerensky government is having a lot of internal problems. They're not frontline dependent. The offensive, it could be made, the case can be made, simply accelerated what was already happening. That being said, this might be more akin to that in that case. These Russian soldiers don't want to be wasted away in pointless attacks. And as you're saying, certain generals are making their complaints known. But at the same time, they're not just going to collapse when the Ukrainians attack. So it actually might be like that.
So I want to talk a little bit about what exactly happened with the Prigozhin rebellion. Because I think the order of operations here, and what actually occurred, really important to understand the impact on both the army and on the morale. I definitely agree there are some similarities, but I think there's some key differences. First difference mainly be that it wasn't something that was initiated directly by the frontline regular conscript soldiers, right? It was something initiated by an elite. by the head of the Wagner Group. That's really important. And some other sort of important things is just in terms of how it happened. So there was a strike on Wagner Group forces, which are not at the front lines at the time.
Yeah, they've been pulled back.
They were pulled back. They were not at the front lines. And after that strike, Prigozhin goes on social media and says, we're going to attack the Ministry of Defense. And shows up in Rostov-on-Don unopposed, takes over the damn city. So the first sort of shocking thing about this, rebelling Russian forces took a major city with no resistance. Then marched on Voronezh. There was some fighting. And then declared they were marching to Moscow, and barricades were put up all over the city. And then, even a crazier thing happened, and Lukashenko, of all people, the president of Belarus, comes in and says, we've come up with a negotiated deal with Prigozhin, and Prigozhin's going to come to Belarus, and any Wagner forces who want to come with him can come with him. Apparently, Lukashenko had to call multiple Russian authorities to get the guy's phone number. This is how bizarre this whole damn thing is. So, what's crazy about this whole thing is someone literally said I was going to take on Russia, take on the entire country of Russia with my private military of supposedly 50,000 people, but 50,000 people weren't all there, right? And
I think he had 8,000 with him. I think
the guy's still alive.
Yeah,
I just want to emphasize how insane that is. If you had a head of a private army, who was fighting in a war for the United States, come up and say, I'm going to march on Washington and overthrow the government, the guy would be dead, right?
So Eric Prince, you think if he had marched on Washington in 2007?
So there's multiple things that make this insane, right? Because Lukashenko coming in and coming up with a solution to this problem.
That is pretty crazy.
Right. I want to emphasize how nuts that is. Because this isn't Putin showing power, right? Putin didn't deal with the problem. His lackey
This is Putin showing ass.
That's right. So, this is essentially, if the United States invaded Mexico, Eric Prince, as the head of Blackwater, was fighting on the front lines against Mexico. Mm-hmm. And then Eric Prince takes the Blackwater troops. They march and successfully take Birmingham. They march on Atlanta. There's some fighting outside of Atlanta. And then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau comes in and says, you're welcome to come to Canada. This is crazy stuff, honestly.
Yeah.
And it shows, and I just want to say really quick, it shows profound weakness of Russian state capacity. Profound weakness.
Yeah, I would agree with that 100%. What did the FSB do during the 2 days that this mutiny was happening? They barricaded their headquarters in Rostov-on-the-Don and just sat there. Yep. Where was the FSB? Where was the National Guard? These vaunted security organs that are watching everyone's back or reading everyone's emails and texts. They didn't do jack shit. Putin showed up on national television looking stressed, being like, these people are traitors. We're going to destroy them. And then within a day, it was over, and they were allowed to go to Belarus. I agree with you 100%. It shows how weak the Russian state has become. And I think in some respects, and I think one interesting thing about it is people weren't rushing out to defend the Putin regime. People stayed home. People were out in Rostov-on-the-Don. Some people were, in support of Wagner. There's video and images of other people not. But no one was rushing to defend the Putin regime. No one was throwing up barricades. It was what would have happened if Wagner had gotten all the way to Moscow? Well, I think Putin fled. He wasn't there. But yeah, it shows It's amazing how kind of weak the Russian state kind of showed itself to be in regards to all of this.
I think they let the. I think one of the things that was really bad for them is that Prigozhin had been doing, social media posts, and he had an increasing antagonistic relationship with a lot of the Russian leadership, and I think one of the main things that's really embarrassing for them and for Putin with this one is that they didn't just nip this in the bud right away. As to the coup itself, I mean, the questions I would have then is, why then did they stop? And at the same, remember, this attempted coup is going on in the midst of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, which I go back to. If this coup is as threatening, why can't the Ukrainians capitalize on it at all immediately?
So,
and also, last but not least, if Putin's removed, let's say the coup works, what's going to happen? Is it going to be somebody who's actually more hardline about Ukraine? There are people much more hardline than Putin on the question of Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, so those are really good questions, and I think some of the answers we have are sort of imperfect. So So Stephen Kotkin, a very famous Russian historian, did a interview with Esther Klein on his podcast, on New York Times podcast. I recommend everyone listen to it. It's a really great sort of hash out of the entire Prigozhin coup and what we think happened and what didn't happen. But to sort of get at a few of your questions, Sean. So first off, the reason why the Ukrainians couldn't take much of advantage of it is Prigozhin didn't, like, the Wagner Group wasn't actually holding any part of the front lines, right? So, like, it just requires that stagnant line to still stay there, which it did. But
so it doesn't cause the front line to crack because this unit, this very, and we say elite. I mean, like, they have some troops in there that are not elite, but this unit has been really played up in Russian media in the last few months because of the fighting in Bakhmut.
Right, exactly.
Very popular military unit.
So the other aspect of it is that while no one joined, while parts of the Russian state didn't join Putin to immediately crush the Wagner Group, they also didn't join the Wagner Group to overthrow Putin. So everyone sat on the sidelines, and I think Prigozhin was expecting more allies to come to his aid.
You know what I hear is the big one?
They did.
You know, here's the big one. He actually does have. Apparently, he has. Apparently, the one part of the Russian military he had the most friends in, if you will, was the Air Force. And so, when those helicopters showed up to start attacking his men, they say that at that point he went like, "Okay, this isn't going to work." Like, my feeling on this coup is that Prigozhin, when I said failed to nip in the bud, what I think was going to happen is that Prigozhin knew that eventually his head was on the chopping block, probably over financial stuff. That's what it looks like. Try to get him on some corruption charges, right? So he just preempted them and said, well, screw it. I'll roll the dice and see what happens. Because the coup also, to me, has the hallmarks of something that is a bit of a rush job. And you can compare that to, say, the Napoleon's coup in 1799. He made sure he had every piece in place to pull that coup off, including political, but also military support in Paris. So in other words, Napoleon made sure that he was had very good relations with Lefebvre, who eventually became a marshal. And he knew that Lefebvre wasn't happy with the government. He played that up, and Lefebvre joined him in the coup. Prigozhin one just seems like a rush job.
I think that's a good point. And I think the good question is, like, to what extent is this motivated by Prigozhin's own goals? To what extent is this motivated by his own kind of desire for wealth or power, or trying to save himself when all this ends? I think a lot of his personal ambition, or at the very least, trying to save as much of his prime financial, catering, military, industrial empire that he has I think a lot of it is motivated by his own kind of personal desires, ambitions, goals, or just trying to retain what he has built for himself or stolen for himself. And
Yeah.
I think kind of it did seem rushed. It seemed almost over before it began, and the comment about the Air Force is interesting. But yeah, I think a lot of it. I think there's a personal that a Prigozhin's ego, I think, played a role in this as well. I'm not sure how much of a role, but probably an impactful one.
And I also think it's a little bit of a turf war between Shoigu and Prigozhin, right? And that's why he marched on the MOD, because there were reports out that the Ministry of Defense wanted to put the Wagner troops under the arm of the Russian military.
Yes.
That's
fully
Prigozhin's
integrated.
power base. I mean,
Yeah.
Putin paid the Wagner Group $1 billion, right, between May 2022 and May 2023. So part of it is a turf war over the sort of internal functions of the Russian state. But the fact that it even got to this point shows a massive sort of lack of state capacity and lack of power on Putin's part, right? That this couldn't be resolved internally.
Yeah, that it wasn't resolved internally. You say that Putin moved too slowly against Prigozhin, or he was about to, and then Prigozhin jumped. I think the most telling one is the degree of what you guys are saying is that there was not a lot of support for either side, and I want to look more into that one myself. But if that one's true, especially with Russia, then all you need is a more well-timed coup. Somebody who actually knows how to pull one off, like Napoleon.
Exactly. And that's
But-
the
But
that's
what
kind of the
coup
scary
are you
part.
gonna- That's the question: is what kind of coup are you going to get? Are you going to get the guy who says, "I'm tired of the slow and steady advance in Ukraine," which was, by the way, one of Prigozhin's complaints?
Yes. If you get a coup, in my opinion, it's going to be a right-wing nationalist coup. That's even crazier than, like, that's even more genocidal against Ukrainians, more nutty, and frankly, a security threat to the whole world. I don't want, I would not want Prigozhin to have to be in control of the Russian nuclear armed force. That's a very scary thought. And his likewise allies are some of the very ultra Russian Orthodox people. They're radicals, and you don't want any of them in charge of a nuclear force.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think if Putin is gotten rid of in the middle of this war, I don't think it's good for most of us. I think it would probably be replaced by someone who's far more nationalist or is willing to fully mobilize Russian society or use even more extreme methods in Ukraine. Although it would be interesting to see if that happened, what would happen in Russia itself. There are tensions increasing amongst the various non-Russian regions of the larger federation. And I think if it went even more nationalist, while the war would intensify in the short run, I think in the long run, there could be major institutional structural issues in Russia itself. With if they do go even harder on Russian nationalism, are the non-Russian republics in Russia, and to what extent are they going to continue to support the war or even continue to support Moscow? I think it could inflame regional tensions further down the line.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder too. So Prigozhin, if he is just on the sidelines at this point, this means that because the Belarusian president now effectively controls Prigozhin, that the Belarus would have a role in any kind of regime change that might happen in Russia because they could always set Prigozhin loose.
Well,
I think the real winner of this is Lukashenko. Like,
yes.
He was like just like this big clown, kind of like, he was basically a puppet state of Putin in Russia, or a puppet ruler of Putin in Russia. And then he kind of sweeps in and seemingly negotiates this whole thing, and it's like, what?
Well, he was never a puppet. He kind of reminds me of Erdogan, where playing both factions off against each other and essentially pissing both factions off. That's what he did up until the invasion. Really, at this point, he's definitely more allied. Russia, but him and Putin are not the best of buddies.
I mean, it is interesting. Russia almost certainly made the request to Lukashenko to commit Belarusian troops to this war. And he didn't, right? So he allowed Belarus to be used as a staging ground, but not commit his own troops. And now with this Prigozhin play, it seems like he was trying to get all 50,000 soldiers of the Wagner Group to come to Belarus. It didn't sound like they didn't. They did. It sounded like actually many of them just joined the Russian army.
Yeah.
So Prigozhin's kind of, I mean, he's not really a player in this anymore, right?
Well, I mean, like we call him like head of Wagner, and but he's also in many ways like the media face. I mean, there's a whole bunch of generals underneath him, many of which do not go along with this at all.
Right.
He also found it interesting that Putin was adamantly opposed to private military forces, but he made an exception for Prigozhin. And, he assumed Prigozhin was his guy, and then this blew up in his face.
Like semi-private. It's like a semi-private military. They're somewhere between like the French Foreign Legion and BlackRock.
See, I was thinking they were somewhere between the French Foreign Legion and Saddam's, whatever he called it, his personal army, the Republican Guard.
No, Republican Guard was that wouldn't be right. Republican Guard was like part of the Iraqi army, like fully integrated. I don't know. It was a weird hybrid, semi-private, mercenary-ish army, but also like worked hand in glove with the Russian military, used Russian equipment, took orders in many cases from Russian generals. So it's a weird. It's an odd outfit. It's not something we're used to in America. That's for sure.
Safe to say a failed experiment that will never be repeated.
Probably not.
I think it had its successes, but
I mean, the risk of it turning overall, on your capital is a little too high for any of their battlefield successes to, really count.
The battlefield successes. No, well, the thing about I said the successes because Wagner organization. One of the reasons for their success is they do actually have like a good command and control. They have good officers, especially in the upper echelons, that are good at planning and also learning from mistakes. In that regard, it's actually very, of its type, it's one of the most successful around, right? However, we're talking about it marching on there and that being a failure. That goes right back to Machiavelli and in The Prince. He says mercenaries are useless in the end. He says that they have no loyalty to you, they have loyalty to money. And if you run out of money, or if they decide they're going to take things over, then they'll march on you. So, Machiavelli literally says, never, ever do anything like BlackRock or Wagner PMC. Ever. He's emphatic on that point. And I believe in the end Machiavelli is correct, even if Wagner, for that type of organization, is a particularly effective one on the battlefield.
Yeah, I'm inclined to believe that mercenaries are not the way to go in general. But,
Would you say?
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, mercenaries are not the way to go, man.
Well, especially if you're a country employing them and you're not the wealthiest player in the game. Because, again, like you said, mercenaries are mostly loyal to money, so if another player came into the game and offered you money, then they're probably going to betray you.
They're also like a separate power base, I mean, this sort of stuff almost reminds me of like ancient Rome, or even the case of like the Napoleon, right? Because you look at Napoleon, he essentially created an entire power base in Italy, where he was practically dictating things there, and it's from that power base he used to take France over.
Although with the Wagner group, they definitely are mercenaries and they are loyal, I think, to a big extent, cash, but they're still, I think, a very Russian nationalist group. Like they didn't defect over to the Ukrainians. It was just an issue of money. I don't know. Ukraine could buy out the Wagner group. I think it's also important to a little bit of caveat there to be like they Wagner and Prigozhin don't oppose the war. They oppose how it's being fought, and Prigozhin opposes being under MOD control. But I think it still goes a caveat to the larger point that mercenaries can't always be trusted.
Yeah, yeah. No, essentially what we're saying is that, and I'm glad you brought it up. Fully agree. I think what it is in this case is because it's not a pure mercenary group, but a guy like Prigozhin had a somewhat autonomous power base, much like Napoleon with Italy, or in the Roman Empire, right? I mean, you think about it in the early days of Rome. Of course, you have your palace coups, but as it goes on, it becomes more about provincial governors who they have their own legions that become loyal more to them than any emperor, especially if the emperor happens to be incompetent. So I think it was, there's Prigozhin. Putin allowed a situation to exist where somebody had a somewhat separate power base who, when that power base was threatened, he just rolled the dice. Which not a good look either. Not a good look.
Yeah. Well, I think this kind of goes to like a larger image of like what is going on in Russia right now, because I still think it is, and I think Sean, you pointed out like the idea that there is this institution like the Wagner Group, this private military company that up until the mutiny seemed to be, or that was fighting alongside the regular Russian army, was supplied by the Ministry of Defense, was fighting under Russian broad auspices, though not under MOD control. Like, we don't really have anything. I don't think we've had anything of that scale in the American context. At least, I don't know fully the size of like Blackwater and the other private military companies in Iraq and Afghanistan. But I think that like, why was Putin kind of using the Wagner Group? Why was this like mercenary group fighting alongside the Russian army? And I think it shows something that we've noted once or twice already, is that I think it shows an inherent weakness of the Russian state. And I know there've been a few articles about this in Foreign Affairs where that there are a few people theorize that Russia is increasingly a failed state, and that there is a lack of like kind of a central authority. Like, there is still very much Putin there, the office, or there's Putin the individual, the office of the president, that is kind of controlling things. But like, what does the Duma do? The Duma doesn't do anything, and instead, like, the Russian state seems to be kind of these fiefdoms, like of oligarchs or high-ranking officials or generals or heads of catering and military companies like Prigozhin, where Putin, and instead of like a state existing, there are these institutions or fiefdoms that are competing with each other. Putin is trying to keep them under control, and I think it showed. And like the with the Wagner Rebellion, where you had one of these kind of seemingly rise up against another fiefdom, the Ministry of Defense, and the others, they just kind of sat still, or what was the FSB doing during all this? And it shows, I think, like, the Russian state is in bad shape right now, and I think I have no idea how it'll play out in the long run. But I think it was a wake up call to Putin that, like, I think the integrity of the Russian state is now openly degrading. And it was also like a realization to the rest of the world, just like how much this conflict in Ukraine is starting to rot out the interior of the Russian state.
Yeah, and it's scary because basically it is a like huge flare to anyone that says it's saying you can challenge Putin, right?
Yeah,
and you might not get killed. Like, the risks of action might not be as dire as we once thought. It's nutty. Like, that shouldn't happen in a great power in 2023, right? This kind of reminds me of, there's a really old YouTube video on the channel CP Gray that talks about the keys to power. I think it's like a very helpful way of thinking about the Russian state. Recommend you guys watch it. It basically sort of explains what Dreeze just talked about, how in authoritarian countries you have people with different fiefdoms, and these different fiefdoms could try to rise up and take the state, but controlling these different fiefdoms is how you keep power.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
and
that's the way that it works. mean, you see it in the Third Reich, of course.
I think unless I'm not an expert on Libya, but that's how Gaddafi kind of held power for all those years, right? Or
Maybe.
Yeah, that's right.
Gaddafi also had a fairly complicated ideology too, where he tried to make committees on every single level, and committees would then elect other committees, and then those committees would eventually meet with him. It's literally, he called it a peopleocracy, but it was actually a committeeocracy. I don't know to what extent those committees actually met as designed, but that was his ideal.
just to make a bureaucracy and hierarchy so confusing that people are more concerned with how it works rather than who's running the whole thing.
Well, also, it's a bureaucracy that involves literally everyone, because there are local committees that then meet, and then you elect people to go to a slightly higher one. That committee meets, and they elect people, and so you build through committee all the way to Gaddafi's group that meets with him.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. That somewhat reminds me of Bourbon French system. Was like under Louis XIV. I mean, the government would say like, "Well, this is what we want to happen," and then like local nobles, authorities, and merchants would essentially just meet to be like, "Okay, well, how do we raise this much money, or how do we get this many troops?" It was very very diffuse, and it varied a lot from region to region in France. So the so morale. I know the Ukrainians, of course, have some of their own problems because the counteroffensive thing, and you're always going to have tension in any kind of war. So what can we say about any internal tensions in Ukraine?
Well, I think if there are, Zelensky has done a very good job to keep them quiet. Honestly, we haven't seen much.
I know there have been I don't have the news stories in front of me, but there have been a few government officials that have been removed, or to use a less polite word, purged from the Ukrainian government, who have been caught embezzling funds or enriching themselves or getting people out of military service.
Yeah, apparently, but I forget the. Pardon me if I'm vague on the details. While since we're up at this, but apparently earlier this year, essentially after we gave Zelensky some more money, we said, "Okay, look, we know you're stealing from us. We get it. It's what you do in Ukraine, okay? But we need you to purge some of the guys who are stealing because it's getting out of hand." And The only thing I do know is that a number of the Ukrainian generals did not want to do the counteroffensive. And what it looks like the reason it happened was American pressure. Because these are like NATO equipped and trained troops who went in there, and they were trained extensively on attacking fortifications. Now, one of the problems too is, did they have enough training? And were they even using the right kind of vehicles for the job? Bradley fighting vehicle, it's a good weapon, but it's not really a tank. It's also very complicated. It takes a lot of training to use that one. The Leopard 2 appears to have not done particularly well. Actually, it appears the Ukrainians prefer Leopard 1s because they're easier to use. Guys, something to keep in mind about some of the Western technology that we're sending in there. It requires a lot of logistical support, and a lot of it, once again, requires a lot of training to use because it's rather complicated. Russians historically have always tried to have by extension, Ukrainians, a lot of their weapons are the same. Which is also something to keep in mind too. One of the reasons Ukrainians have done as well as they have, and vice versa, is that these two know each other, almost like in the Civil War, And then in some ways it's actually better to give them simpler weapons because you can train faster on them. That's what they're already used to.
Right, train faster and deploy.
But I think what that kind of, to branch off that thought, I think it's a question of to what extent is politics dictating military strategy here. I think there's definitely pressure from the West on Ukraine to launch, or has been to launch, some type of counteroffensive. this summer. And I'm also wondering, to go a little bit back, the extent to which politics played a role in the kind of attrition warfare around Bakhmut. That did seem to, at times, according to the press, kind of degrade or evolve into kind of a almost like Verdun type situation where Bakhmut itself is not necessarily of high strategic value, but both sides were committing an inordinate amount of men and material to the whole conflict, because now like issues of national pride and political motivations seem to be dictating military strategy there. And I know there were again news reports from Western officials being like, hey, Ukraine, maybe just withdraw a few miles west of Bakhmut. You're not losing that much, and maybe it's not worth spending so much men and material on this kind of strategically insignificant patch of land.
I think, though, and this is, I think this is like where, if you're Zelensky, you're in a trap, okay? Because on the one hand, that makes perfect sense. And Bakhmut is of some military value, but we're talking about the amount of blood expended on it is beyond what it's worth, the actual land itself, right? However, there's a problem. The counteroffensive they had launched roughly about a year ago, the one near Kharkov, that regained a lot of territory, but they also had like an 8-1 numerical advantage. Russians are very weak in the area, and they withdrew rapidly. Those forces then hit the fortified Russian line and were destroyed. Also should be kept in mind that another counteroffensive was launched at the same time that wasn't heavily reported over here, that attacked a fortified Russian line and was stopped cold. And the Ukrainians have yet to penetrate a Russian defensive line. That doesn't mean they never will. They just have yet to do it. So I think in Zelensky's mind, there's also like, if I lose this, can I actually get it back? Or at least maybe amongst the Ukrainian generals as well. If we lose this, can we actually get it back anytime soon? I think that has to play a part in the thinking. Which somewhat reminds me in the American Civil War, because one of the things I'd like to point out to people is that whenever the Union in the Civil War captured a city from the Confederates and they decided they were going to hold it, like they'd fortify it and everything, Confederates never recaptured it. Ever. A fortified city, heavily fortified city. I'm not talking about like having like a fort outside of town like Winchester, Virginia. I'm talking like Nashville, Corinth, at least when they kept a large garrison there, Chattanooga. You get my drift.
Yeah. I think there's going to have to be sort of a reckoning with the stated aims and the propaganda on both sides here. And we're already seeing it on the Russian side. Pulling back from this rhetoric of we have to take all of Ukraine, talk more about Russian security, talk more about, keeping the Donbass, that sort of stuff. Ukraine's going to have to pull back from their rhetoric at some point too, because right now there's talk of, and there was especially talk about 6-7 months ago from Zelensky of, we're going to completely retake back all of Crimea. We're going to take back the Donbass. We're full territorial integrity of Ukraine. And they're justified in making those their aims, right? But the reality on the ground is, I think, going to force both sides to come to the negotiating table in the year. And the reality on the ground is going to probably remain kind of what we got. I'm not convinced that either the Ukrainian or the Russian army has offensive capability at this point.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that statement. Like you're right. There is, I think Zelensky, maybe to echo a little bit about what Sean said about being in a trap. Zelensky has to say that. Like, I don't think he can, send an inspiring or morale boosting message, being like, we're gonna fight them to a standstill. Maybe we'll keep Kherson and parts of all these 4 unofficially annexed territories or provinces in the east. But Crimea is gone. Like, Zelensky has to kind of make these big statements, and I think Zelensky saying that, and his own persona that's developed during the war is a big component of like why Ukrainian morale is or has been relatively high. But it is. I think there is going to be a reckoning, and I think there is a like Mike said, a major disconnect between the rhetoric and propaganda and reality. And I think we saw that on the kind of the strategic scale when the war first began, where Zelensky was, asking for a no-fly zone over Ukraine. There was a lot of movement and discussion in the press and online about a no-fly zone. And even just a few weeks ago, with the NATO conference in Vilnius in Lithuania, where people online, certain avenues of the press, seem outraged that Ukraine wasn't offered NATO membership or a path to joining NATO. And it seemed like, well, Ukraine was not going to become part of NATO in the short run ever, because then NATO was going to be involved in a war with Russia, or it could lead to like a runaway escalation. But even like people were saying it's a moral outrage that there is no path or there isn't an officially delineated path for Ukraine to NATO. And I'm like, well, that would hinder any negotiations, I think, in the future. And unless big things happen during the remainder of the summer this year, there probably is going to be some type of negotiated settlement that probably won't be terribly popular with large segments of Ukraine and Russia. But I think that's the reality of the situation.
Of course, much like Putin, though, I mean, Zelensky has his crazy hard right wingers he has to deal with, who have openly threatened his life beforehand. And yeah, Zelensky, from what we can tell, is popular in Ukraine. Although I have heard that one thing that people do complain about is that they feel that he did not prepare them for the initial Russian attacks.
Yep.
Yeah, and that. And that meant that I'm not true, of course. That meant at the time there were like rumors like, oh, he's actually working for Putin or something, That's got to be careful too, because, we get a lot of lies from both sides, and in the case of Ukraine, we also need to be careful too, because we're in a country that really wants them to win. So negative stories about Ukraine, how they're doing or whatnot, do get suppressed over here. And negative stories about Russia get played up. Something to always be careful about.
Oh, yeah. I mean, sure. I was laughing when, there are reports about the Prigozhin crew being like, this is going to lead to the fall of Putin. I'm like, you guys are nuts. That's not happening. Right? So there's a lot of willful misdeception here.
Any war. I thought some of the Ukrainian claims, though, they'll be like, we shot down every rocket that was aimed at, a particular city. I'm like, I don't know. It looks like it's on fire to me.
That said, I did want to say one quick thing. I think the end goal of all of this is going to be a negotiated settlement on the front line. And how is Zelensky going to get Ukrainian nationalists to accept that? The answer, I think, in the end is going to be EU membership. Remember, that's what this whole thing started out from. That's what the Yanukovych situation was all about, right? It was about getting EU membership and becoming a part of Europe. And honestly, if we're looking at this from a moral sort of ethical perspective, that's how this has to end. Really, it's not. I don't think it's going to be NATO membership. I think it's going to be EU membership, and and I think that's kind of how this eventually is going to end. But it will take 5 years.
And also, I think Ukraine is going to have to be rebuilt.
Yeah, and it's going to be expensive.
The economy's been blown to pieces. The whole country essentially survives on the money that we give them, which is a very, very tenuous way to keep your war going.
Go ahead, Jerry, sir.
Oh no. I do have a point to make about Zelensky later, but we can continue talking about the economy.
Just economic bad times are ahead for the world. I think Europe in particular is going to be very, very hard hit with what's coming.
With broader trends or with the war itself.
Well, broader trends, but also, the the problems of the complications with Russian gas.
Mm.
You know, I mean, they came out, they squeaked by in the wintertime because because Putin kept selling them gas anyway, so they stocked it up for the winter. But I'm I'm anxious to see what is going to happen as this winter approaches. You know, and I question a certain point, like, can you just keep giving Ukraine money to keep it going, especially if your own economy is in crisis? And a lot of people in America just kind of look around and go like, wow, all that money we could have spent on our own country, which I'm definitely one of those. 100%.
Most people don't even know how much money the U.S. has sent to Ukraine.
You're right about that part, but
I mean,
the
it's a
thing
lot, but
America,
people don't know about it.
look, America's there are a lot of social problems going on, and I get people on tour and they talk about things of their city. And I will say this, guys, in the last 2 years, I've heard more people complain about where they live and the people who are in charge of where they live locally than I've ever heard as a tour guide. Whether that be Chicago, Los Angeles, it's another in Portland, hear that one all the time. So there's just a lot of there's a lot of misery out there is all I'm saying.
Well, there definitely is. But I think kind of to the point of Europe, I think Americans and Europeans view this war differently. I think it has to do with the much close, like the rest of Europe is right there, next to Ukraine, or just west of Ukraine and just west of Russia. And I think maybe not every European country, because I feel like Germany is still has always been dragging its feet in this whole thing. But I think there are some European countries that are ready and willing and have been ready and willing to give until it hurts to Ukraine, because I think they are very much worried about Russian aggression in a more existential way than we are. I mean, Poland is spending its money like it's like there's no tomorrow in arming itself to the teeth.
Yeah.
And I think the Baltic states themselves are ready. I think have been giving until it hurts, militarily or economically to Ukraine. So I think bankrolling Ukraine either for the duration of the war or in the rebuilding process after. I think it'll be hotly. I think it'll be hotly debated. I think it is in everyone's interest to build up a strong Ukraine, or in NATO's interest to build up a strong Ukraine after the war. And I think I hope people are farsighted enough to see that. I know that's not always the case, and there'll probably be a lot of political wrangling around it.
Well, you also say give until it hurts, and of course, the countries you mentioned are the ones where Russia really is an existential threat. How much longer can you go with this in France? That country's dragging its feet. Also, and once again, these countries have really run out of stuff to give the Ukrainians without really hampering their already weak militaries.
I think that's the biggest question, is what happens in, not necessarily the near term as in the next year, but what happens within the next 2 or 3 years for Western European support for Ukraine, politically and economically. And the biggest questions I have are sort of on Germany and France. UK they hate the Russia. That's not going anywhere. And Eastern Europe's going to keep leading on this issue.
Also, the United Kingdom's going through a political purge right now. I mean, if you read about what's happening to Nigel Farage and Jeremy Corbyn,
the UK's, yeah.
No. The UK is it's a fucking joke right now. It's a joke of a country.
But
run by morons.
But my point being, Eastern Europe, regardless, is going to lead on this issue. Like Poland, Czechia, Slovakia, the Baltic states, they're not going anywhere on this issue. So the question is whether Germany and France, and perhaps Belgium, for instance, are going to follow along. And if they follow along, fine. Europe is united. We're probably going to get EU membership for Ukraine. Everything going well, right? If Western Europe doesn't follow along, I think that's where things get really interesting, right? Because does Eastern Europe and the countries that also prefer to be called Central Europe, kind of band together, right? And do their own thing and distance themselves from the sort of Brussels, like Western European controlled EU. And like you could start to see some really big divisions in Europe depending on the decisions that Germany and France make. Right now, they're standing strong with Ukraine. Let's see what happens in a year or two.
Well, yeah, when giving does really, really hurt is the question, right? And I mean, just asking, what do you think's the possibility of Poland putting troops into the war, or Romania,
I
or Romania?
I think if there was a Russian offensive that threatened Kyiv, you could really start to see a possibility of Polish intervention.
Yeah, it's possible. Yeah, I think there's a good chance that would happen. Although if Poland does that, then that could drag the rest of NATO into the war.
Oh, it'd be crazy. I mean, thankfully, I don't think we're ever going to get there. Again, I think we're going to negotiate a settlement, but again, let's see how, especially Germany, copes without Russian gas. You know, they're building a big LNG port at Hamburg to hopefully get U.S. Natural gas shipments.
Well, that's the way in which America in this conflict, in many ways, has been like a disaster for us on the diplomatic front if you look at Asia, because you're like, okay, well, Russia and China are now more closely aligned than ever before. And understand that this has been the policy of America since Lyndon Johnson, and we've been successful since Nixon at keeping them separated. So that's a massive facepalm right there. But in terms of keeping Europe more subservient to America, stunning success. Stunning success.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to comment on the natural gas and energy. Yeah. I think it will be interesting to see where we are in 4 to 5 years. I know like Europe was able to muddle through this past winter, still buying some energy from Russia, and I get the feeling that it will be kind of tight for the next few years. I think with the way this war has played out, even if especially Western European countries aren't willing or able to bankroll or provide military aid to Ukraine much more, I do imagine that they will no longer want to be kind of that dependent on Russian gas or oil going to the future. Because even if you have the best possible negotiated settlement where Ukraine is able to get back some or all of the land at the end, even with Putin and whoever might come after Putin, if they're in power, I don't see Europe going back to the way to its energy dependence on Russia in the future. I don't think it'll be an easy transition, but I think within a decade, you will see probably turn towards more alternative energy, importing liquefied natural gas from other parts of the world, or ramping up maybe more nuclear power. I know they're trying to build more power plants in France, although there's lots of problems with that. I know there's debates about renewable energy, and I think they did shut down the last of the nuclear power plants in Germany, but
they did.
Yeah, which that's whatever. I don't think that was a good idea, but I think that in the long term, financially, and I think the war has been a disaster for Russia's energy, their ability to use energy dependence as a big geopolitical card. I think in the short term it will be very difficult, but a decade from now, if the war ends, in a month with a negotiated settlement, even in a decade from now, I don't think Europe will be going back to being dependent on Russia for huge amount or as large amounts of its energy as it has been.
Yeah, and they can't. You don't play games with the energy supply, right? Like any security risk to your energy supply has to be dealt with. So yeah, I definitely agree with you there. I hope the Germans get over themselves and build some damn nuclear power plants, but that's my take.
As long as they have to be in coalition with the Green Party in order to stop the Is it AFD? Is the
Yep, that's right.
Yes. No, there won't be nuclear power plants. I think Europe's leaders are mostly just clowns at this point. I mean,
I'm trying to
That's a little
figure
bit
out.
hyperbolic, man.
I don't have much faith in these people. You know,
I want to know what Germany's done with that extra 100 billion euros they were going to spend on their military. Have they actually spent it and used it for anything in the past year?
Probably not.
Probably not. Also, the problem with the German military is every time they are, because even before this invasion happened, they were already talking about like increasing military spending, and they just get bogged down endlessly in debates about what they should be doing with their money. You know, like I mean, I don't follow extensive. Whenever I have, I've just noticed the Germans just, I mean, it's they drag their feet on this stuff. You know? It's I don't know. I think economically, Europe. I think most of the trends that I see involving energy, demographics, the fact that most of their countries have, with Britain being the worst, having incompetent political leadership. I think this is going to be a really horrible decade for Europe. You know, and they're going to become more dependent on America because we are going to be the ones who are actually essentially going to prop them up at this point. I mean, they have to get liquefied natural gas from us. That's actually more expensive. You know. Oh, don't forget though, they do buy Russian gas through India sometimes, which is more expensive. I mean, you know, and that goes another thing too as well. I mean, you know, Europe joined in with the sanctions war, but most of the rest of the world said we don't care. You know, and some of that's because, you know, Putin does have like friends around the world. I'd say Putin's Russia has been much better at foreign policy, at least outside of Europe, than a lot of the Soviets ever were in some regards. But also, I mean, a lot of these other countries, I mean, they just look at it as like, you know, we'd rather get, you know, food and gas from Russia. You know, which should also be kept in mind too that, you know, if you measure Russia by commodities, it's like the second wealthiest country in the world. You know, in terms of things that are really important, like food and gas. And not to mention the fact, and Michael brought this up earlier, you know, the Iraq War. These countries haven't forgotten what we did there. So us rattling on about this naked aggression, it's like, you know, we're not the biggest goddamn hypocrites around, especially when you have, you know, Joe Biden, who voted for the Iraq War. Lots of neocons and liberal internationalists who voted for the Iraq War. The shadow of the Iraq War does hang over this more than people like to admit. That's because Americans right now really, really prefer to forget that it ever happened. And I do admit the amnesia over that does disgust me.
It gets frustrating.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. We
all, you know,
it pisses me off every time I think about it, you know, and I can't help but think that maybe you could have gotten more countries. I'm not a critical mass of them. A lot of them are like, hey, we'd rather get the food and the gas from Russia and the fertilizer. But maybe you could have gotten more of them if it had not been for something like Iraq, which put a very bad taste in a lot of people's mouth. Not to mention what happened to Gaddafi, which I'm of the opinion that was decisive in making sure the Great Reset with Russia didn't go anywhere.
Yeah, it probably influenced it.
Well, they say Putin looked at it on repeat and started when he'd meet other world leaders in other countries, like say you go to Iran or these countries, say don't negotiate with the Americans, you'll end up like Gaddafi. Or if you're going to negotiate with them, be really, really careful.
But it is also worth noting that sort of actions to destroy a potential sort of detente happened on both sides, right? Like Russia's invasion of Georgia in 2008 definitely made that reset hard.
I want to look more into what precisely happened with Georgia.
So I can just give a quick rundown. There are these two supposedly separatist regions called South Ossetia and Abkhazia. There was a internal conflict between South Ossetia and Georgia, and Russia used that as an excuse for a full-scale invasion.
Okay.
And they also equated the issues in Abkhazia and South Ossetia with what NATO and the United States have done with Kosovo in Serbia. Like, you know, the Abkhazians and the South Ossetians, they're not too keen, or in the past they weren't too keen on Tbilisi. And it's definitely kind of I think a bit of a tit for tat there. At least the Russians frame it as such.
Well, there's two things to note with that one. As far as the Kosovo thing goes, fun little thing. I was in Greece right after that happened,
Mhm.
and somebody kind of told me like, be careful in Greece. They don't like Americans right now, you know. And yeah, I saw a lot of anti-American like graffiti. Like one of the images I saw was like it was Godzilla with Bill Clinton's head devouring Serbia. And of all the countries I went to in Europe, and there are many I went to in that summer, I definitely got the most negative reactions in Greece. I guess they were upset that we were meddling with affairs to the north, right? But in the case of Georgia, I mean that goes back to the Bucharest statement. We're like, well, we think Ukraine and Georgia should join NATO, and they got the WikiLeaks thing showed that Burns, who was ambassador to Russia, had sent a memo saying that if you try to put Ukraine in NATO or you continue Western influence there, this is what will happen. They see it as an existential threat. Which it is. Equivalent, once again, it's the equivalent of what if Mexico joined the anti-American alliance? How would we feel? Very much threatened.
Of course,
They have a fortified border and everything. Oh yeah. We'd be like, anyway. So I know it's about 11, so it's a bit of my cutoff. Does anybody have like other burning things they want to talk about?
Oh, I did want to make a point about going back to Zelensky, and something that I think has been played down in Western media, and that I kind of had to not dig too much to get it. You can just type it in the Google and find it. But he has canceled elections in Ukraine for the duration of the war, which I heard that because I was thinking a bit ago, like, oh, there might be an election cycle ramping up in Ukraine. I was like, I wonder how they're going to do elections in the war. And then the statements come out, I think, in the past month or two, or maybe a little more or less recent than that, that Zelensky has canceled the presidential elections, or going to say they're not going to happen until the war begins, or rather, till the war ends. And on the one hand, I definitely get that because I don't think there would be a question of Russian meddling. They would try to meddle as all hell in that. And if Zelensky lost, transferring of power in the middle of a war like this could be incredibly chaotic. But part of me was also like, I get it, but I don't necessarily like that that they're canceling elections in the middle of the war.
Yeah, well, I mean that then you get to like the whole state of exception thing where everything's democratic until there's a crisis, then you go into dictator mode. But yeah, apparently what had happened was a few months before that, one of these Russian generals, I guess maybe he was talking too much, said that they were really wanted to see what happened with the next election. The guy was American. Like, what you mean, like the presidential election with Joe Biden? He said, no, Ukraine.
Cool.
And I guess once that became clear that the Russians were going to wait to see what happened there, Zelensky did that. And of course, I mean, like you said, people have been purged, opposition parties suppressed. I mean, anybody saying that Ukraine's like a well-functioning democracy with an open press really doesn't know anything about that. But also, God, what was the other one too? I'm sorry, I can't remember it right now though. Yeah. Anyways, sorry guys.
That's right.
Yeah. So I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. Pardon everybody. It is extremely. I work outside and it is very, very hot right now. This is the hottest summer I've ever been in. This is the hottest summer I've ever worked through, hands down.
Yeah, that southern heat wave is serious.
God,
stay hydrated, folks. Be careful.
It was a fucking scorcher, man.
It was, I think, on Wednesday it was 104 degrees here, so it's not just in America.
Wow. I mean, that is pretty horrible.
Larger questions of a greater looming concern here, but
Yeah.
So I was going to mention, Sean, if you're heating your time limit, Derek, should we do some super chat questions really quick before we head out?
Yeah, we can go ahead and hit those up. These haven't been too hard tonight, so let's see. We'll start back here. First one came from Dan Hicks. He just gave $10, no comment, but thank you, Dan. I'll see if you posted something under your. Well, it's long lost now. He might have said something under his comment, but it's unfortunately lost to us. But thank you, Dan. Next comment was from Old Man from Berlin for $5. He says, "Thanks for the stream, gents. Mearsheimer was right. How many divisions does the Pope have? Type of situation with regards to who is right here. V said." I'm not sure I understand the question about how many divisions the Pope has.
Oh, that's a comment that Stalin made, or supposedly made in the aftermath of the Cold War, where the church was criticizing the Soviet Union or something along those lines, and Stalin kind of off the cuff was like, "Yeah, how many divisions does the Pope have?" Which, the answer is not many.
That's the line.
All right, I get it.
Yeah, he's referring to John Mearsheimer being right, which I do agree with.
I disagree with Mearsheimer, but I'm not sure we can hash all that out now.
Yeah, I agree with this analysis of the situation. All I can say is I agree with this analysis of the situation, and I do agree with his overall frame of how countries operate.
Well, he's an old school realist.
And as I am as well.
Right. Yep. You guys have gotten a very good liberal internationalist versus realist debate today.
No, I could have. No. I got a very gentlemanly one.
Yeah. I don't know. Debate doesn't necessarily mean massive arguments or anything.
That's what I want, though. I mean, you watch some of those YouTube debates where people. I'm just like, this is nothing. This is just two people who are. I prefer something more like a discussion to a debate. Most debates, honestly, I find most debates, unless you've got two really sharp people, I find most debates kind of cringe.
Yeah, that's fair. Discussion is a more accurate term.
No, discussion is like discussion. How can I say this? It's just better most of the time, Although if you do get a really good debate, it's great, but you just don't get a lot of them.
Right. I mean, most debates tend to devolve into just people sticking with their talking points and
exactly
being so afraid of having their talking point defeated that they just play defense.
That's actually the last debate I saw. That's essentially what happened, and I was like, God, this is stupid.
Yep. All right. Well, our next comment comes from Oscar Palacios for $20. Thank you, Oscar. And he says, "Sucks I can't watch the stream because I'm watching Oppenheimer. Love to see you guys back. I believe Russia will eventually win this war by attrition, unless this war becomes global. I give it 2 more years. Much love when you coming to Colorado." Well, thank you, Oscar. Hope Oppenheimer's good.
Yeah, I'm probably going to see it next Thursday, although I'm kind of... Christopher Nolan, to me, is a bit of a hit-and-miss director. But I think it's going to be worth it. Anybody going to do the Barbenheimer thing, where you watch Barbie and then watch Oppenheimer?
Probably not.
We've discussed it. It's a possibility, but probably not.
Yeah, at first I was a bit intrigued by the Barbie movie, but now I'm just like, no, fuck it, I don't give a shit.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to have to see it because Tina wants to see it, so...
Yeah.
Fair.
It happens, I guess. All right, Juan Sibley for $4.99. Thank you, Juan. He says, "Thersites proving why he's one of the best to ever do it. Thank you for the hard work, good sir." Well, thank you, Juan, for your donation. Next up, we have Ganon 2D, which I think that's a reference to Metroid, right?
Is it? Or I hear Ganon, I think Link. I think Zelda.
Well, maybe it's Link. Maybe it's
Zelda.
Okay. Yeah. I'm not much of a Nintendo guy. I mostly play Sega and Sony and Microsoft. Anyway, Ganon says, "If
do
the
you
US..."
do you have a big Sega T-shirt or something? You need to get one, man.
I do have one. I actually have a Sega Saturn shirt.
Oh, fucking cool, man.
Yeah. I got it fairly recently, but anyway. He says, "If the U.S. didn't bomb Nordstrom, then who did?" I guess we never talked about that. The pipeline and also, was it a bridge or dam that also got blown?
Well, Nordstrom's the pipeline that's in, I think it's Nordstrom 2. That's the pipeline from Russia to Germany, I think.
Yep.
Yeah,
And
through
then
the
there was
Baltic.
Then there was the Kerch Bridge that connects Crimea to Russia over the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea.
Yeah, I think it's Nord Stream, right? Not Nordstrom.
Yeah.
I think it depends which language you're talking.
Oh, okay. Yeah, because Nordstrom looks very German to me, but also, of course, it sounds
Isn't
like the
Nordstrom
retailer. Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say that's a
Yeah.
department store. So maybe.
Yeah, it is Nord Stream. But anyone have any ideas on this? I kind of shrug my shoulders. It could be a bunch of people.
With the who bombed the pipeline?
Yeah.
It could be Russia. It could be other places. Could be Ukrainian frogmen if they have frogmen.
I mean,
Yeah.
I'm
I think-
about 99% sure it was us.
Oh, you mean just to get the economic benefits of forcing the Russians to, or not the Russians, but the Germans to buy from us?
Yeah, well, we got the equipment and the know-how. We'd made threatening comments of that type. I mean, remember, what's the point of NATO, right? To keep Germany down, America in, or France in. That's another one people say too, and Russia out. I don't really see any benefit to the Russians blowing up their own pipe that gives them leverage over the Germans. Ukrainian frogmen. I mean, I guess maybe if they have I don't think they have the technology for that because it'd be a major project. Now that being said, that one is plausible too. That's why I'm only saying 99% sure. But I did like how the Nord Stream pipeline gets blown up, and then media doesn't really talk about it too much. There's almost no investigation of it until that piece came out by what's his name? The one who exposed the My Lai massacre back in the day. The one who put out the report that said it was us. That comes out, and then within a few weeks, I want to say, we get the cover story about an independent group of Ukrainians, not officially tied to the government of Ukraine, blowing it up, and that was a ridiculous story. I can't believe they went with that one, but I guess that just shows how little they think of us.
Yeah, I mean, the one culprit I might rule out is Russia, because I know some people said, no, they blew up their own pipeline. Given how much
ridiculous.
money they were making off of it, I think we can rule them out as a culprit.
Yeah, that one's just ridiculous.
Unless it's part of Prigozhin's grand plan to make Putin look terrible or some shit. Or I like what somebody in the comments said earlier. They said it's part of Lukashenko's master plan.
Yeah.
To turn Russia into Greater Belarus.
Yeah, exactly.
The other two possibilities that that were entertained was maybe the British, because like we said, they've taken with the Western European countries, they've taken the most hardline stance in the war. Boris Johnson played a major role in making sure that negotiations were scuttled early in the war. And one possibility they didn't put out at the time, but I don't think it's them, was the Poles.
I was just about to say.
The thing about the Poles too is, I think the Poles have another objective with all this as well. I think Poland believes that they can become the leading country in Europe,
Absolutely.
not Germany or France. And they're trying. And this war is a means to that end. And the Poles and the Germans, for historical reasons, but even currently, they don't really get along particularly well. There's tension between those two countries, but yeah, I'm 99% sure it was us.
I will just say really quick, Polish economic growth suggests that at some point they are gonna sort of catch up.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking too.
If you want to see sort of where Europe is going in 20, say 10, 15 years, strong Poland.
Yeah. Are we going to get Poland-Lithuania coming back from the ashes?
I mean, maybe. This is what I'm talking about in terms of alternative political solutions if Western Europe shrinks away from stuff, right?
Could reform the Swedish Empire.
Yeah.
Turn Belarus into Greater Poland.
Yeah. Or just have a Europe-wide empire ruled from Minsk under the inspired leadership of Emperor Lukashenko.
Anyway, shall we move on?
Yeah. Our next question comes from LJS27 for 4.99. Thank you, sir. And he says, "Do you think Russia is doing better or worse than they performed in World War One? Thanks for the stream."
Force.
Yeah, it's hard to say because the
I
thing
vote
about Russia's
better.
World War One showing is that when they were fighting the Germans, except for the very early part, very very early before Tannenberg, they mostly did horribly. But when they were fighting the Austro-Hungarians, well, they were basically like the Germans fighting the Russians in that case. Because there's that big of a quality gap. So Russia had two very different performances, and also they did really well against the Ottomans.
Yeah, that too.
So I guess overall, if you balance it out, I'd say they're doing worse right now. But keeping in mind that they did have some fairly easy opponents in World War One, but also one opponent they had no real chance against.
Although with the World War One comparison, they were fighting one great power and two sort of
Paper
great
tigers.
powers at the same time, and yeah, paper tigers. And here with Russia and in Ukraine, you have Russia, which is largest country in the world, supposed to have one of the top militaries, and it can't defeat a medium-sized country in open combat.
Ukraine is not a medium-sized country.
Well, it's biggish, but it's not very powerful. It's not very well developed.
Population-wise, it's a medium-sized country.
I disagree. I think they're doing better than they did in the First World War. They have suffered no defeat that is on the scale of Tannenberg.
But they also haven't won any battles comparable to, say, the Great Offensives of 1916.
They're not losing territory either, which they are definitely doing in the First World War.
They're not fighting an opponent who could capably take territory. Let's be real.
Yeah, they're basically not able to gain ground on the equivalent of not Austria-Hungary, but Romania or Bulgaria or one of the minor powers from World War One. It'd be the equivalent of them stalemating in that scenario.
I actually let's be generous. Let's be generous to the Ukrainians. I actually think Ukraine and Austria-Hungary, compared to modern-day Russia, and pre-World War One Russia, is a fairly decent comparison. And let's look at the effectiveness of the Russian Empire against the Austro-Hungarian Empire and compare it with the ineffectiveness of the Russian Empire against the Ukrainians.
You say ineffective. They've seized large chunks of territory. That a lot of it is some of the most economically vital parts of Ukraine as well.
Right, but also it's been a year and a half of the war, and 2 or 3 weeks ago, the Russian government almost fell apart. It took 3 years for that to happen in World War One.
I would say two things. I'd say one, I don't think the Russian government was near falling apart. With the Prigozhin thing, I think it's an embarrassment. I think it's bad for them, but I don't think they're near falling apart. At the same time, though, this is my opinion. I believe the Russians had the correct strategy to win the war. That's why I've believed from the very beginning that they're going to win the war. Now, I think we're also used to fast, flashy victories because of the Gulf War in Iraq, and that's just not this kind of conflict. And being an artillery army and fighting a war of attrition like this, in my opinion, this favors the Russians in the end.
If the Russians in World War I were only fighting Austria-Hungary, they would have marched into Vienna.
Yeah, in 1915 probably too.
Correct.
But the thing is, Sean, because you're right about Russia's traditional method of fighting. The problem is that with modern technology, I'm not sure if that model is still viable because of just how much logistical support and expense it takes to keep a modern army in the field, and how dominant even a small handful of hyper-advanced weapon systems can be when they are online and operational and have ammo and everything else.
Well, I think the other problem you run into in this war is both countries see this as an existential war. And there was never a doubt that the Ukrainians were not going to fight fiercely, at least on my end. Now, I thought the Russians would do better. But I do believe the statements about Russian incompetence in this war are much overstated. And I think it's a misunderstanding of Russia's aims in this war and the way they've prosecuted it. I do believe the attrition strategy is going to work in the end. However, gentlemen, we won't know until whatever treaty is signed is signed.
Where do you think the treaty will be signed? Like, what city will give its name to this treaty?
Brest-Litovsk, of course.
Yeah.
Guys,
The second treaty of Brest-Litovsk.
no,
Yeah.
no,
I guess that's my ultimate point. Actually, no. That's my ultimate point. I'm wrong for saying that they're doing better, because this is like when we did the presidential ratings, and I said I'm not rating Trump until his presidency's over. I mean, I'm not going to. I think Biden's awful right now, but who knows? Maybe he does something miraculous in a year. I don't know. I mean, I'm pretty sure he won't, but I wouldn't rate Biden. I'm going to go with the same thing on this one. Not until the war is over do I actually want to rate the Russian army. Because it's Russia. I mean, in the Napoleonic Wars, if you rated them before 1812, I mean, hell, Napoleon himself used to say the Russian generals are the worst I ever faced.
Yeah.
Or what else he say one time? He said, the Russia has the best soldiers and the worst generals. But 1812, there's a turnaround there. Same thing in World War II. So I'm going to give it till the end of the war to make any kind of statements like that. So I'm even wrong for saying that myself.
joke's on us. There won't be any official into the war. It's going to be frozen conflict.
It'll be like Korea, yeah. You'll have a...
No, a frozen active conflict, right?
Seriously. Anyway.
I mean, well, that's what happened. Well, okay.
All right,
I don't think so. I think it'll. I mean, I don't know the time frame though. I mean, because some people are like, "Oh, this will be wrapped up in a year or 2 years or 5." I'm like, that is one I really don't like speculating on as time frames for war.
Well, we have an interesting question up next from our next super chat. Comes from Achaemenid Arsenic for £5. Excellent username. And he has a duck as an avatar. Nice touch. He says, I was wondering, has there ever been a breakthrough against a well-prepared defense in depth in history?
And I'm going to step away for half a second while you guys chew on that.
I'd have to think about that. Well, off the top of my head, I'm not thinking of one. And I just thought, going back to my Civil War stuff, when the Petersburg lines are overrun on April 2nd, 1865, the Union attacks all along the line. They break the line where the Confederates had no backup line. The Confederates had a backup line, which was right near Petersburg. They were able to stop them. Off the top of my head, I can't think of one this very moment.
Somebody named the Hindenburg line.
I mean, I guess a defense in depth, like Battle of Berlin, like where the Russians had to they attacked the Salo Heights, which was a defense in depth. There were several days of horrific fighting, but eventually they broke through. This is also Germany in April 1945.
Right. What about Normandy?
Normandy? Yeah, I don't know. No, I'd have to look more into that. But the breakout, of course, we carpet bombed the area first, of course. So the units that were there, the German units that were there, the soldiers who survived that was one of the most horrific experiences of their war experience. The veterans who were there, so it was the most horrific things they'd ever witnessed was the carpet bombing that preceded the breakthrough.
Yeah, it's hard. I guess it's also hard to know exactly what would qualify as defense in depth and what was more of an attempt at it with insufficient resources.
What was the were the Allied lines against the with the German offensive of the spring 1918? Were those considered defense in depth?
The German lines or the Allied lines?
The Allied lines.
Definitely.
Yeah, no, they had defense in depth, but also they didn't actually break through at any point, really. The initial offensive, Operation Michael. Operation Michael. I mean, it chews up the line. They inflict heavy losses, but they don't actually break through, and they were stopped just short of their major objective.
Are you talking about what ends up being the Second Battle of the Marne?
No, that came later, and that definitely wasn't a breakthrough.
Although I've read differently. I've read that effectively was a breakthrough and that did send some shockwaves of panic in Paris.
But did they contain it very quickly or something
They
then?
did contain it, but the general on the front had loaded this front line, and that's what they attributed the
Oh,
failure
okay,
to.
yeah, yeah,
So
okay.
the German
Sorry.
artillery wiped out the army that was supposed to repulse the attack.
Yep.
So obviously that general got canned, and Petain had to basically throw in all his reserves near the Marne to staunch the bleeding. So the Germans
Oh,
did blow through the entire line,
okay.
and then they had to be stopped afresh.
They did blow through the line in Operation Michael, but when I say break, yeah, I
I
guess
guess it has to, one has to define their terms. What is defense in depth? What is a breakthrough?
So I guess
yeah.
technically, yes, it did break through the line, but because their follow through was so difficult in World War I, it ended up still not being enough.
And also the initial losses going in are so heavy. By the way, real quick, I did recently see a movie about Operation Michael called Journey's End, which is based on a
Oh, that's a
British
real good
play.
one.
Yeah, it's a really good movie, man. I
It's
was very
sad.
impressed.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah, acting was superb. Writing was excellent. It was really good, and very very unusual too. I mean, it's just a build up to
Yeah.
Operation Michael. I mean, you see Operation Michael only briefly at the end. I'd never really seen that in a war movie where it's all just build up.
Mm-hmm.
But that's one where you could pull that off. But yeah, no, so recommend that one. But yeah, I guess so. I guess so. But it also be kept in mind too that with that one, the Germans' amount of artillery and troops they put into it, and the troops were using advanced tactics as well that the Western Allies had not quite encountered. They encountered the proto version of it at Verdun. And actually that'd be another one too. Verdun, the Germans did overrun the French trench line. The first week or two of Verdun, the Germans are pretty much rocking and rolling.
Yes, because the French were ill prepared. They'd stripped down their defenses, and also their rail lines did not run to Verdun.
Yeah, and
But
also just kept in mind too, the Germans were using like proto stormtrooper tactics at Verdun to get
yeah,
the penetration in. Yeah.
um, one of Joffre's great achievements was allowing Verdun to happen.
No,
Anyway,
you. This is the thing. This is the thing. Yes, you can definitely penetrate a defense in depth. It's of course much harder, but it seems that it really comes when you've got stripped down defenses, or you get a situation like Germany, April 1945.
yeah. Somebody said Yom Kippur War that the Israelis broke out of a defense in depth and then pulled off an encirclement.
Yeah, I've got it. I don't know a ton about the Yom Kippur War, except that both sides left that war really hoping not to fight another one.
It's
Yeah.
stressed out.
Yeah, because you think about that war, like, I mean, the Israelis, I mean, that was the one they took the most losses. That's the one that really freaked them out. At the same time, the Egyptians took heavy losses, and they felt like, oh my God, we missed our opportunity.
Right.
That's one of those wars that really left both sides shell shocked.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we can think of plenty of examples where a defense in depth worked, not as many where it failed, unless we're talking about a power that's in the process of collapsing. Actually, the all-time master of World War I defense was a Bulgarian general, Vladimir Vazov, who was so good at it that he was being attacked by the British, who were vastly better equipped, and he was still just absolutely beating their asses on the Salonika front.
Oh God, the Salonika front, that was a nightmare.
Well, it was pretty good for the French, terrible for the British, though.
Although I love that quote when they is it Ludendorff or Hindenburg? I think it was Hindenburg. They asked him like, so why did the Central Power suddenly collapse in 1918? He said, oh, the fall of Salonika, because that started the chain reaction. Was the breakout from there?
Well, really, it was that troops were going hungry. I mean, that's really what.
Well, yeah,
made
but
things
no, I'm talking
collapse.
about the immediate cause. Like,
Oh,
they're losing on the Western Front, but the immediate cause is the breakout from there because it knocks out the Turks and the Bulgarians, and then the Austrians, who are really starving. I mean, they're starving worse than the Germans, right?
yeah, for the Austrians, their last gasp was winning Caporetto, but not completing the victory over Italy. So once the offensive became clear it wasn't going to end the war, they were pretty much done.
Yeah.
Um,
It's always interesting about motivation there too, because the Austrians can fight well against the Italians, but they were most in the defensive, but also they were fighting somebody they genuinely were upset with.
right.
Also, it helps when you actually have some decent generals on the front line.
Yeah. All right. Our next question comes to us from Emperor Tiger Star for $5. Thank you, Tiger Star. And he says, I personally wonder if Moldova will be scared into joining NATO and EU. Apparently, even Moldovan support rejoining Romania has gone up too recently.
I'm excited for this question. So
Oh yeah, have at it, man. I don't know anything.
so my answer to that is yes and yes. I would not be surprised if Moldova joined the EU and joined NATO. And as a recent, how do I say this, convert to watching Eurovision, I have to say, watch Moldova's acts. Moldova's acts in Eurovision are incredible. Art. They go up there and have fun, and they're the most weirdest, hilarious, amazing acts ever. So, go Moldova. I hope they win Euro 2023. I haven't watched yet. Don't tell me who wins. And Moldova stand here with all my friends.
Moldova stand. No, I can definitely see them. I kind of doubt they would rejoin Romania, but yeah, I think they are full on to wanting to get EU and NATO membership in the long run or the short run.
Yeah, I'd probably more likely to get NATO before they get EU, actually. Mainly because of the economic stuff.
Although I don't know, there is that whole issue with Transnistria. I can't see them getting. I don't know. I think the path to NATO would be difficult with that whole issue there. I think it'd be easier for them to get EU membership.
Really? Okay. Huh.
I think I don't know what's been going on in Transnistria since the war began, but who knows?
Good question, though.
Yeah, it is an interesting issue. I mean, I feel like in general, what Russia has really accomplished is giving NATO a renewed lease on life. Because if there was ever a question about whether NATO was useful for countries in Eastern Europe, that question just got answered.
Yeah. I mean, you wouldn't have Sweden and Finland joining NATO if it wasn't resurgent.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and there's also the amount of pressure that America puts upon Europe as well. But yeah, that's definitely one of the big fallouts, you know. But something else too. It's the war has tied NATO together stronger, but has also shown the limits of our ability to have other countries outside of Europe join something like a sanctions war. You know, so like a lot of wars, there's a lot of complicated implications from this.
Just a real quick note about the Finland or I guess more Sweden joining NATO. I know Turkey was really dragging its feet on it, but did you guys see? I think just in the past day or two in Iraq, Iraqi crowds stormed the Swedish embassy, and Iraq cut off all relations with Sweden because I think another video of a Quran burning in Sweden kind of emerged online.
Jeez.
Oh wow! No, I didn't hear about that. I know for Turkey. I know for Turkey to agree, Erdogan says the parliament has to vote on it, and that's his way of
dragging his feet more.
Delaying things in case there's other developments because he's Erdogan and all he's guaranteed to do is to piss off side when it's convenient for him.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right. Our next super chat comes to us from Ken Cook, $4.99. Thank you, Ken. He says Ukraine's demographics were bad before the war, and now with the deaths and refugees from the war, I don't see them becoming a successful state post-war.
It'll be difficult.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the countries have demographic problems. China, Russia, just about all of Europe. But I don't know if too many countries are gonna have as bad demographic problems as Ukraine when this is over. I think what was the estimate, like 3 million men of military age at least fled when the war started out of Ukraine.
I mean, the irony is a lot of the refugees and migrants are making successful lives in Poland right now, right? So, ironically, if you want to look for sort of a sort of post-war boom, I could see it happening in Poland because Ukrainian refugees in Poland are probably one of the only sorts of demographics that could integrate well in that country. And,
I think
immigration to this country has made it, paper over demographic issues, definitely.
I think maybe also how the war ends could also uh, affect the demographics. Like, I think that the war is going to end on the negotiating table. And if we have something like, a Korea situation or Russia holding on, or there isn't that big, touchdown, overwhelming victory. Would refugees come back to Ukraine? Would there be a booming? Would there be a baby boom in Ukraine? I think or I don't know. I think if Russia was totally defeated and they were driven out of all the occupied territories, there'd be a greater likelihood that we could see some type of baby boom and an accompanying economic boom. But I think how the war ends could also affect how Ukraine turns out demographically. Although the odds are stacked really against it because the population was declining before the war began.
I would say, being from New Orleans, which you may have heard lost population back in 2005, a lot of people will return when it's over, but a lot won't. And this city still doesn't have the population it had pre-Katrina. You know.
Oh wow, I didn't realize that.
Oh yeah.
Oh no, not just that. We lost population last year for the first time since Katrina, and we're going to lose it this year.
And then is that New Orleans or Louisiana as a whole?
Louisiana, yes. New Orleans. I mean, we can just go to the laundry list of problems. One of the most immediate ones is in the last few years, the rents have skyrocketed here, and landlords absolutely refuse to lower them under any circumstances. And there's actually apparently there's a landlord group in New Orleans. They all talk to each other, and I need to see the stuff. My brother showed to one of my other friends, and he was horrified by what he saw in there. But yeah, the two rentals in front of me. When I moved in here, the middle thing in the French Quarter, it's like me in the back upstairs, guy below me. Well, that time a couple below me, and then opera singer across from me, priest underneath them. Okay, those rental units when people would move out, they would get filled right away. There was a few months here it was just me back here, and this rental unit across from me has been vacant for a year. That's insane. But he absolutely refuses to lower the rent. So we are losing population. And that's one of the big immediate causes that I've seen. So yeah, I mean Ukraine, they can recover some population afterwards, but demographically this is really this hurt them really bad. It's take a long time to recover from something like this. Especially the longer the war goes on, the more these other people will have created successful lives elsewhere. And if they have created successful lives elsewhere, they'll not go back to Ukraine. The ones who go back to Ukraine will be the ones who did not create successful lives elsewhere, typically.
Yeah, I guess too though, with the deep ties don't I have to Poland, which is nearby, this does mean that hopefully there will be a lot of investment in Ukraine from Poland.
Maybe. Always keep in mind, though, too, there is some tension with Poland because of Western Ukraine, but I want to get into that can of worms. What's our next super chat?
It comes to us from Philip for $5. Thank you, Philip. And he says, "Hi guys, I dream of one day becoming a nuclear engineer in Germany. Is there any advice you guys could give me to accomplish this?" Well,
Good one.
I guess get experience in other places where there are nuclear plants, and then when Germany reopens some of theirs, you can go back.
If you're serious, you have no idea.
Yes.
Go somewhere else.
And if you're not a native German, make sure you know German, so that way it'll eventually happen.
Yeah.
I don't know.
No,
I mean,
no, actually, I will say one sort of serious note. Now might not be the worst time to go into nuclear engineering in the U.S. I was actually just talking with a friend of mine who works for an energy consulting company about a week ago, and she basically said the next 5 to 10 years are sort of a make or break to see whether those the modular mini nuclear reactors are going to start coming online all throughout the U.S. So lots of jobs probably going to be available if those work.
Yeah.
yeah. Or I don't know. I'm trying to think you could become a solar power expert. Um, Lots of wonderful jobs in places like, well, if you do wind energy, places like Indiana. No. All right. Next one comes to us from Steve Parton for $10. Thank you, Steve. And he says, Romans of Renown is the best series. Septimius. Thank you. Well, thank you, Steve. I appreciate it. And that's definitely one that I enjoy working on. Next one, and I believe it's the final one, comes to us from LJS27 for $4.99. Thank you, LJS. And he says, do you think there will be more cooperation between NATO and Japan/South Korea in the future?
Yes.
I think so. Yeah, I think Poland's buying out or buying a lot of heavy weapons from South Korea, I believe, especially tanks.
I mean, straight up, Japan and South Korea are freaked out about China invading Taiwan, and that is a possibility. And so you're gonna get more closer military cooperation between Japan, South Korea, and primarily the U.S., but also through NATO over this issue.
Yeah, the Europeans right now they haven't quite decided yet overall how they're going to treat China. Especially with their own economies taking hits right now. I'm very much of the opinion that at this point we run the show in Europe, so I think they're going to go along with whatever we're going to do against China.
Yeah, I mean, there was a sort of scenario, I'd say probably about 10, 15 years ago, where China is less sort of ideological and less sort of totalitarian. Like when Hu Jintao was the leader of China, you had more of a sort of communist party like committee system going on, but Xi Jinping really has made that country significantly more totalitarian in ways that really rubs both the U.S. and Europe in sort of the wrong way. So
well, and I mean, we're doing our own decoupling from China. As symbolized by the Taiwan patch in Top Gun Maverick, because they took it off of them for the Chinese market, but then for when they actually released the movie, they said, "Nah, fuck it, put the patch back on." So no, it's just they'll have a move against them. Yeah, and Xi Jinping. I think Xi Jinping's more, from what I can read on him, I think he's more ideological than Putin is. I think I said practical with Putin. I think Putin's just opportunist. Like, for instance, people were like, "Who's that guy, Alexander Dugin?" They were like saying that that's Putin's philosopher. It's like, no, not really. Actually, he doesn't really read his stuff, and he kind of made scoffing statements about the guy until like the last year or two. Putin's an opportunist. Xi Jinping, I think, actually has ideology behind him.
Yeah, I mean, it's still a communist country. I think they're not as common now, but they still roll out the big pictures of Marx for the big party conferences.
My brother had a Chinese roommate, and they asked him, like, so what do you like learn Marx? And he said, yes, we read it. So it's still a thing over there.
Well, his rhetoric on the Chinese dream was very interesting. And I think, I agree with you. There's an ideological project there, no doubt. Also, quick note, there was also like a huge big protests against Xi Jinping's zero COVID policy on U.S. campuses by Chinese foreign exchange students.
Interesting.
It was all over OSU. So
they had them in China too. A lot of protests as well. I'm not an expert in Chinese history, but I do believe there is. I mean, there is like a tradition of like peasant protests actually being like more effective than, say, in Europe. Because in Europe, peasants protest, they just get slaughtered historically. But yeah, it was interesting, man. Or what's our next super chat?
Our next one is from Gequitz for $5. Thank you, Gequitz. And he says, thoughts on Survivor Man, Lestrade, which I believe is a reference to a show from Canada.
I've never heard of it.
I haven't either. I just Googled it so I know what it is before we got the question, but unfortunately I have no idea what it is. And at first I thought it was like a nickname for DeSantis because there was a little DeSantis discussion in the chat after it, but apparently that just happened spontaneously. Um, but yeah, I'm not big. Other than Trailer Park Boys, I don't know very many Canadian shows.
So, yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I, this is just from my own sort of yeah, research and stuff and reading, but I always find the Survivor shows kind of funny, right? The Survivor
Yeah.
Man, like not the Survivor reality TV shows, different sort of thing, but this sort of like survivalist stuff, right? Because what it usually entails is some white dude going out into a rural area and being like, oh, here's how we survive in the quote unquote wild, right? And doing stuff that, I don't know, indigenous peoples have kind of regularly lived in these places for, tens of thousands of years, right? There's just something very, I don't know. I feel like a lot of good academic articles could be written on the sort of Western gaze on indigenous lands.
Oh wait, is this the guy who would go in and he'd only have like a pocket knife and not even maybe have clothes? Is this the same guy?
I don't know if this was the same guy, but I was just reading on Wikipedia. Yeah, like brought like.
All right, I
food,
might have actually
water,
seen this show, and I think about it.
So you're trying to tell me, Michael, you think this is like LARPing colonialism in a way?
A little bit, yes.
Okay. I might have actually seen this show. My grandpa was really into it back in the day. That and Bear Grylls, or his name was. Yeah, those are shows I never found interesting, but they'd be on in the background a lot. So I'd watch little snippets of them here and there when I was visiting my grandpa, but never really got into it personally.
Cool. Actually, here we go. Stroud and a support group went to seldom visited area of Kenai Fords National Park in Alaska without a permit, and a support group camped near a sensitive archaeological site, probably of the Dena'ina people. So cool, great guy. Not a fan.
You know what I'd like to see? A survival show, but the host and star is Alex Jones. And that all of his survival tips are useless, and it turns out at the end of the episode he was actually only like 50 feet behind his house the whole time.
Well, he'll just bring like a little box full of all his like supplements and whatnot.
This is a natural man. Back when men were out in the woods like this, you had to take these supplements. You could only get them from bison. I'm a bison now. And you got to have this vampire repellent spray. New World Order.
Keep those globals away.
Yeah.
Oh God.
Hey, if you want the generous reading, it's like the Faustian spirit of Western man has to prove itself. Or you could be the one with like, you got no other way to prove yourself as a man right now, so you desperately try to prove yourself with something ridiculous like that. I'd say what I'd like to see. I want to like have him like rebuild the Titanic. And we'll just stick a bunch of people on the boat and we'll just sink it. And just see what happens. I've been reading up and watching a lot of sunken ship things on YouTube because there's a fuckload of that stuff.
Because of the
those videos get a
included.
lot of views. Like you throw the name Titanic in a video, you're getting a ton of views. Not to mention any of the other ones, of course.
Yep.
Yeah. Let's just do that, man. Let's just reenact the Titanic.
There you go.
Hey, it's survival. Can you survive the North Atlantic?
Not if your submarine's made out of carbon fiber.
Oh God.
And then parts from an RV camper store and an off-brand Logitech controller.
Yeah, I feel bad for the French guy who died on there because he was like a Titanic expert. Feel bad for him though.
Well, he should have been smart enough to not get on the goddamn thing. Then he should have known enough about underwater exploration to know what he was looking at. But I guess to be fair, the thing had gone down there several times before.
Yeah.
Which is incredible.
I'm curious what he was doing. Well, I'm saying curious what he was doing there. And pardon me, I forget the French guy's name, but he led like the second expedition of the Titanic after Ballard discovered it in 1985. And he had been down to the wreck over 30 times and had written at least one book on it and was considered like one of the leading experts. So I feel bad that we lost like an expert on the ship and the wreck, you know.
Sure.
Yeah, I feel bad for him. And also, I mean, you know, I think he was also maybe acting as a kind of a tour guide on the boat on the tour on that as well. So I'm sorry, I lost a fellow tour guide who was going to the bottom of the ocean to go look at a wreck.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's
Well-
also I love that quote that the guy who was responsible for the disaster had, where he said effectively that safety regulations are just a waste.
Yep. Makes
Yeah,
sense. They're getting in the way of innovation.
Yeah,
Well, you know, I mean, like all that you just now said smacks of the original Titanic, which I think that's why everybody's kind of into this, is all these parallels, right? But you know, I mean, being fair to the Titanic, right? Beautiful ship, very well designed for its time. A lot of great safety features, you know. Like understand, Titanic had advanced safety features. You know, the blow that it takes is unusual. And it takes that blow because they're going 22 knots through an ice field when the ocean's at a dead calm. And being a dead calm means you can't see the iceberg because you can't see the waves hitting the iceberg. So the iceberg sneaks up on them. You know, so, you know, Titanic had great safety features for what it was in that regard, you know. Not a poorly designed ship. But people talk about the lifeboat thing. Should be noted about the lifeboats, though, real quick. They were following the regulations, but the problem is the boat was so big it got past the regulations. But they would not have had enough time to launch the other lifeboats anyway.
there's also the issue with the Titanic too. I guess it was based on the latest and greatest thinking of that era, but clearly it wasn't the best design because if you look at the sister ships, they also met premature ends.
No. Olympic served until the 1930s. Great ship.
Britannic didn't.
Britannic hit a mine.
Hit a mine, yeah.
Though. Oh.
Yeah, that's something you're just that. I mean, those ships weren't built for taking damage from underwater explosions. And keep this in mind too. Like early in World War One, there was a German U-boat that sank 3 old cruisers very easily because they weren't thinking about protections with things like torpedoes and mines. So ships made before they're really making advanced torpedo defenses would go down like a rock if they get hit by that kind of stuff. You know,
But with Britannic, like a lot fewer people died because they crammed like a hell of a lot more lifeboats onto it, right?
yeah, well, they had enough lifeboats. They were able to do things very quickly as well. I mean, they had better training. You know, Titanic crew was a bit taken by surprise.
They were also in the Mediterranean, which is a lot warmer than the North Atlantic.
Yeah. One thing they both had in common, they both sank the Titanic sank in a dead calm, which is, they say that's, if you're a sailor on the North Atlantic, that's like a once in a lifetime event, you know, but Britannic didn't sink in choppy water as well.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't in rough seas. I think Britannic only like maybe 90 something people died on that one. It took about it took about an hour to go down. But yeah, no, they had enough lifeboats. They also had a better lifeboat. They also had a better system for lowering the lifeboats. Because with Titanic, I think they had these automatic crank systems in the Britannic or something, but the Titanic had to do a hand crank. So anyways, you know, not as much lost life. But fun fact, there was a woman on Britannic who was a nurse who was on Titanic.
God.
Womp womp.
Oh yeah, well, everybody just went to her for advice. She said, "Listen, this is exactly what you do."
Did she survive the second time too?
Of course. And there was a man. I want to look into this because I want to look into this again because there's an argument about how many boats he was on. But there was a guy who was on the Titanic who was a stoker who apparently was on either the Empress of Ireland and/or Lusitania.
Oh man.
Yeah. I want. Don't quote me on that one. I want to look that one up again. I haven't read about him in a while, but did survive both of them.
He's really devoted to his profession there.
Yeah, well, I don't think he probably wasn't. No, he wouldn't have been on Empress of Ireland because Empress of Ireland, I mean, sank in 14 minutes. Anybody who was below deck, the chances of survival were next to nothing because how quickly the ship goes. Lusitania went fast too, 19 minutes.
Oh.
Yeah.
I guess the real question is if Titanic happened again, would anyone bother playing the violins on the deck?
Yeah. One would hope.
Yeah.
And
Die in style.
I'll
leave you with this one though. One last sunken ship thing. There's the La Borgne, which was this French, not really an ocean liner proper, but a French passenger ship, very fast, large for its day. It sank in 1898, and part of that was that the ship had already hit several other ships, and the French line at that time was like known for being reckless. Anyway, boat sinks in 30 minutes. Because of the way it's sinking, there's only enough life. Because it's sinking so quickly, they can only launch the lifeboats on one side. And I've run into this a lot, especially pre-Titanic. A lot of times when a ship sinks in the 1800s and there's not enough lifeboats, the crew will start throwing passengers off the boats. This happened with the Evening Star and with the Arctic as well. So the crews back then would be like, fuck the passengers, we are going to save ourselves. And so Livornia sank, and there are all these accounts that are written afterwards of people being like, yeah, I watch crew members like, taking out knives and like cutting people's hands off and things. So the idea of like the Titanic's crew, like what they even did on the boat, because the crew took horrific losses in that ship. That was pretty crazy. That was not what crews usually do back then.
Yeah. I mean, and also somebody pointed out, if the people just knew how to swim really, really well, they could have survived. That and used the Bene Gesserit ability to regulate your metabolism to deal with the cold water. So between those two things, that's how you survive a shipwreck.
So hey, there was a guy, there was the baker who was in the Titanic. He was in the cold water for a long period of time and actually did survive somehow. But he was drunk. He was completely drunk. People are still shocked though that he lived. He's apparently the last guy on the boat too, because he was on the. You can see him in the James Cameron movie, which by the way I don't like, but you can see him like when the ship's sinking. He sees people falling off and he keeps drinking
with the flask.
With the flask. And what he said was that he was hanging onto the stern, and then right before the boat goes underwater, he stands up and essentially walks off the boat into the water. Anyway, Eventually he got onto the collapsible that second officer Charles Lightoller took command of, and they dragged him along and they kept him there because they're like, he's still alive. Then when one of the guys died on the boat, they lowered him in and then they brought him up, and he lived. So there, I guess he's a Bene Gesserit, huh?
Yeah, maybe. Somebody says he was a stoker, not a chef.
He was a baker.
Oh.
Ship's baker. He was one of the bakers in the ship, was the drunk guy I'm talking about. Yeah, he wasn't a stoker.
Okay.
Well,
we do have one last one. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. Well, we got
go ahead.
way more super chats than I thought we were going to get.
Yeah, that's because they rolled in when we started answering them. Steve Parton for $10. Thank you, Steven.
All right.
And he says, better general, John Zemeckis or Leo Phocas? And just by way of reminder, Leo Phocas was the brother of Nicephorus II, an accomplished general in his own right, and of course the uncle of John Zemeckis. If it's purely tactical, I would go with Leo Phocas, because he pulled off some pretty impressive ambushes. But if it's a straight-up field battle, I'd go with Zemeckis, because he's more charismatic. So he's more likely to inspire the men and get them to push through to victory. So that'd be my answer to that question. But both of them are very, very good generals, so you can't really go wrong either way.
Nice. Well, I'm hitting about my time limit.
Oh, it's only 11 a.m.
Yeah. I guess Dreeze still has the whole day ahead of him at the Kazakhstani archives.
Have a good time there, man.
I might still be able to get to the library today.
Great.
Dreeze's day is just beginning.
Yep.
And ours is at an end.
Dreeze, I'm assuming you're in, I guess it's not really called Astan anymore, Nur Sultan?
No. I'm in Almaty.
Oh, you're in Almaty. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay, cool,
that's
cool.
where the big former Communist Party archive is.
Wow. For 100 Almaty is kind of nuts.
Yeah, no, yeah, it was hot. I was actually I was in Bishkek earlier this week as well, and it was triple digits there.
Really? Jeez.
Yeah,
FYI to viewers, these are cities next to mountains. They don't typically get that hot.
yeah. So it's a sign of the times.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Well, I've heard it also Central Asia's been getting increasingly arid.
Yeah, especially out by the Aral Sea, like that's all been rampant runaway desertification there because the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya were all dammed. But yeah, there's the governments in Central Asia, environmental concerns and kind of the diversion of waterways and dammings of rivers has led to a lot of issues with the availability of water in certain parts and like there are natural deserts in Central Asia to begin with, and they're just kind of getting bigger and bigger, which is also concerning.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I guess that just about wraps it up. Thank you everybody for coming out tonight, and thank you, Sean, Michael, and Dreeze for showing up and doing this with
Definitely.
me. This is a good
Yeah.
stream, I thought.
Thanks for organizing. And
Mhm.
Dreeze, best of luck on your research out there.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Be sure to collect some potassium because it is the best in Central Asia.
I'll put that on my souvenir list.
Yep. Bring me back some.
Will do.
All right. Good night, guys. Take care.
All right.
Hey, Seth.
Peace out, everybody.
Oh, wait.
Take care.
Hey, wait. 1 second, everybody.
Okay. What's up?
Wait, no, sorry, I forgot to turn my microphone off. But I do want to mention that Carter. Thank you everybody for being out here. But also, Carter Stroud said it's currently midnight in New Orleans, so the day is just beginning. Yes, he is correct.
Yeah.
A good sign off.
Yeah. All right. Well, good night, everybody, and we'll see you around. Next week, I'll have some uploads, including one about the Roman equivalent of Jeffrey Epstein, so be on the lookout for that. Because there actually is a Roman equivalent of Jeffrey Epstein, believe it or not.
Oh my God.
Find out about that on Monday. So, until then, I'm Thersites the Historian. Peace out. All right, we are off the air.